Chapter 6:24. Dusk, 10,000 Hills. The northern wilderness was a desolate and barren land. It was common to see mountains, forests, and other barren lands. Moreover, it was the coldest season in the northern wilderness. The cold wind was blowing, and it sounded like the howling of the abyss. It was really chilling to hear. All of this was a constant reminder that this was not a place suitable for normal humans to live in. However, at this moment, there were tens of thousands of figures leaving the human gathering place and entering this desolate land in this cold season. Young Marshal, we found some tracks and 2 horses. We can confirm that Orson did not lie to us. Her Highness Lan Shah has indeed entered this place. But Shi Wei frowned and hesitated for a moment before continuing, but it seems that Her Highness Lan Shah only has 1 bodyguard with her. Only 1 bodyguard? Yes, it's that Andre from the Savage sect. This person is the best around her. Shi Wei raised his eyebrows as if he was very familiar with Lan Shah's small group. Haha, it seems that our Highness is very confident that she can escape our search. Nodding, Shi Wei seemed to be more convinced by this judgment. He then frowned and said, "Young Marshal, Orson's attitude seems a little off. When we arrived, the savage bear tribe was already in a state of alert." Waving his hand to interrupt, Anna narrowed his eyes and said, "Ignore them. Even if the savage bear tribe is really betrayed by my clever sister, they will need at least a day or so to form a real fighting force." Pause for a while, then change the topic. "Haha, you don't think that we can't catch these 2 people in a day, do you?" Shi Wei was silent. That was the truth. No matter how heaven-defying Her Highness Lan Shah's methods were, she was still a girl who did not know any martial arts. Therefore, in this encirclement where the advantage was obvious, the outcome was almost certain. Of course, whether it was the silent Shi Wei or the seemingly confident Anna, they both knew that Lan Shah was not stupid and would not do something so obviously stupid. However, they also knew that they had no way out. They had to catch the other party as soon as possible. "Let's talk about this area." Anna was the first to break the silence. He raised his head and looked at the barren land nearby. "I want to see what kind of battlefield Sister Lan Shah has chosen. There is no special terrain here. It's just that the area is over 100 kilometers of no man's land. Moreover, there are ravines, dense forests, and so on. It's rather complicated. Well, from this point of view, it's quite suitable for hiding." "Oh? Then what are we waiting for?" Anna shrugged. "Since His Highness has already made a move, we naturally can't refuse. Let's go, let's go, I can't wait." The hunt for his life had begun. Mountains, deep valley. Shi Wei's scouting was accurate, and the terrain here was extremely complicated. With Bran, perhaps only the 100,000 mountains could compare to it. Tang Tian's, Lin Tian Thousand. Liang Mountain. Even with the burden of Lan Shah, if Tang En wanted to shake off the pursuers behind him, he could easily do so by increasing his speed. However, they didn't enter the mountains just to escape. They also had a mission to lure the pursuers, so they couldn't be reckless. Sometimes, they even had to stop for a period of time. Dusk was approaching, but a bonfire was already lit. There was no special preparation, and the smoke rose into the sky. Whoosh! The bushes parted, and Tang En walked out with a fat hare in one hand and some berries in the other. At the same time, Lan Shah, who was staring at the flames, suddenly turned his head and raised his arm. Several brightly colored berries were very eye-catching. "Don't be impulsive." Tang En looked at the berries that could kill people several times in an instant and waved his hand. The hare in his hand didn't seem to have died, and it woke up when Tang En cried out in surprise. It frantically kicked its legs. With a wave of his hand, more than a dozen real berries were accurately thrown to Lan Shah's side. Following that, Tang En flicked his index finger, and with a thud, the struggling hare fainted again. Tang En walked over and looked at Lan Shah, who was hugging his knees and sitting next to the bonfire. He chuckled. "Haha, are you a little scared in the wilderness?" Lan Sha glanced at him, as if he couldn't be bothered to answer such a boring question. He carefully picked up the berries and looked at them carefully under the light of the fire. Tang En couldn't help but curl his lips. Don't worry, it's not poisonous. I'm not like a certain someone. Tang En's wilderness survival skills were needless to say. As long as he didn't deliberately do bad things, even if he didn't recognize some of the fruits in the northern wilderness, he wouldn't do such a rookie thing as picking poisonous things. As for Lan Sha, Tang En was a little surprised. Originally, he thought that although Lan Sha was a ruthless character with a high level of intelligence, she should be lacking in wilderness survival knowledge after all. To be honest, Tang En was prepared to bring along a burden on the road from the beginning. But the facts proved that Lan Sha was indeed Lan Sha. Even when faced with things that were completely inconsistent with her status, such as checking the toxicity of the berries and so on, she still did it very professionally. After examining them, Lan Sha grabbed 2 green fruits and casually threw them out. These are tough fruits. They taste very bitter and are not suitable for eating. Tang En smacked his lips and thought to himself, all right, looks like I'll have to go to the space later and use my blood energy to exchange for some information on the creatures in the northern wilderness. The berries didn't matter, but handling the hare could only be left to Tang En. Tang En didn't have much to say about this. Although the two sides were still in a hostile relationship, Tang En still had this kind of demeanor. Besides, if he didn't handle it, he wouldn't be able to eat it himself. After skinning and bleeding, the hare was cleanly sent to heaven while it fainted. He skewered it with a wooden stick, set it over the bonfire, and sprinkled some seasoning powder that he had just conveniently collected. Taking advantage of this short time, Lan Sha used a branch to gesture a few times in front of Tang En and said calmly, "The pursuers should have already entered the mountains. Our bonfire has been burning for about a quarter of an hour, which means that they will catch up in another quarter of an hour at most. This is our current position. When the time comes, we will have a few escape routes." Lan Sha had no problem with the overall situation. What's more, the pursuers were still behind them, so they couldn't play any tricks for the time being. Thus, under the guidance of Lan Sha, in an orderly manner, explained the following itinerary. But after listening for a while, Tang En shook his head. "This won't do. If it's just to escape, I can take you to shake off the pursuers now. But since you want to lure the enemy, running in front of the enemy like this will affect their enthusiasm." According to Lan Sha's plan, it was a replica of their previous escape in the small mountain range. This was also what Lan Sha was good at. In terms of the overall situation, he was able to anticipate the enemy's every move and move around the periphery of the encirclement, neither close nor far, but not entering. There was no problem with this plan. Coupled with Tang En's abnormal speed, it was unlikely that the pursuers would catch up with them. But the pursuers weren't fools. After a few times, they would naturally be able to see the clues. At that time, it would be really hard to say whether they would continue to chase after them or not. Of course, such a result wouldn't be a loss to Tang En. But Lan Sha now made it clear that he wanted to keep these tens of thousands of traders here. Then, there was a problem. After all, Tang En was carrying the strange poison on his body. No matter who it was, he wouldn't feel at ease. Tang En naturally hoped to solve the problem here as soon as possible. The sooner he found out about the antidote, the better. Lan Sha frowned slightly. "Then what do you plan to do?" "We can try to take the initiative to enter the enemy's encirclement. Of course, we'll retreat safely in the end." Tang En spread his hands. "Just like the northern wilderness proverb you mentioned before, since the rabbit has been released, why not put it next to the eagle's nest? The chances of catching the goshawk will be higher this way." No. Lan Sha knew the flaw in this plan, but no matter what, it was better to be safe. So, he shook his head and rejected it. This is playing with fire. There are too many uncontrollable factors. If we're not careful, we'll fall into the abyss. And the rabbit is just a bait. I don't want to be eaten by the goshawk. Don't worry, we're partners now. You should try to trust your partner. After all, although my life isn't as precious as yours, I only have one life. I don't agree. TSK, you little girl, I'm thinking for you. How can you refuse to listen to me, TSK? Don't think I don't know that you're only doing this for yourself. In the midst of the quarrel, the rabbit meat quickly emitted a fragrant aroma. The two of them did not pay much attention to it. They tore it into pieces and continued to argue at the same time. In fact, this kind of argument was inevitable. It could be considered a disagreement in philosophy. Tang En was good at precise control over a small area, while Lan Sha was good at strategic planning and predicting the enemy's move. If there were enough people, or an excellent team, the two of them would be the most suitable partners as long as their relationship was good enough. However, although the two of them were temporarily cooperating, they were in a state of hostility. There was no trust at all. In this way, when facing the same thing together, there was no doubt that there would be differences in choice. After a round of argument, no one could convince the other. Instead, they attracted some wolves. I can tell you very responsibly that your plan has no future. Hey, you surrounded me before. What happened in the end? In the end, you were caught. Bah! If I wasn't in a bad state at the time, you would have the chance to catch me. The exasperated words suddenly stopped. Tang En's ears twitched. He frowned and looked to the left. Lan Sha's observation was very sharp. Although she did not have Tang En's abnormal senses, looking at the other party's expression and calculating the time, she knew that the pursuers were coming. She quickly got up and pointed to the back. Let's go, break out from here. Don't get excited. Tang En was calm. He continued to bite the rabbit meat slowly. They haven't arrived yet. Even if they did, it could only be a few scouts. Don't worry, it won't be too late to leave after eating. You! Lan Sha's pretty face suddenly sank. She was born to be in control of the overall situation. Every step she took was precise. It didn't matter if he was stupid or slow, but she couldn't tolerate subordinates with casual personalities. However, Tang En was used to being free and undisciplined, or it could be said that he had an occupational disease of being alone. He also had a natural resistance to orders. Both of them were very confident in the things in their own fields. They indeed had the right to be confident and even proud. This was their first cooperation. They were like two hedgehogs, unable to get close to each other. Just as Lan Sha was thinking that it seemed to be a mistake to bring this guy to escape, Tang En suddenly raised his eyebrows. Oh, you're quite fast. As soon as he finished speaking, he threw away the rabbit meat in his hand. His figure burst out and flashed to the west like a ghost. Almost at the same time, several figures poked their heads out from behind the ancient trees to the west. It could be seen that they had just arrived. Unexpectedly, the Grim Reaper had arrived in an instant. Suddenly, there was a commotion. As the figures intersected, a few blurred blood lines flashed and disappeared. The commotion stopped abruptly. The figure at the back reacted the fastest. Seeing the situation, he hurriedly jumped out. However, just as the figure was in the air, a black shadow flashed in an instant. Then, he could only watch as a dagger drew a freehand arc and went straight between his eyebrows. Puff! Bang! He kicked the scout's corpse into the bushes and clapped his hands. In a short moment, a certain someone used his own method to restore the scene to silence. Tang En half bowed, the corners of his mouth raised. He waved his hand and made an inviting gesture. Your Highness, please. Lan Sha narrowed her eyes and walked over expressionlessly. Undisciplined and undisciplined. Chapter 6:25. The twilight gradually deepened, and the dark moon hung low. At this time, the sparks continued to light up, wander, and intertwine. If one looked down from above, they would find that these sparks were flanking forward, like an ancient behemoth with a bloody mouth, silently swallowing something. There was no doubt that these sparks were the torches in the hands of the tens of thousands of pursuers. The first contact not long ago had been reported back to the Central Army. Anna was naturally overjoyed when he couldn't find anything. Then, he cast a big net for this specific area. On the right, at the forefront of the sparks, in a small dense forest. After advancing here, the sparks paused for a moment, probably hesitating whether to include this place in the encirclement. In the end, some sparks went in, and the sound of footsteps was heard. "They're here." Murmuring in a low voice, behind an ancient tree that was about 3 people's arms, 2 figures sneakily poked their heads out. Seeing the sparks not far away getting closer and closer, they instantly shrank back. "Just do as I said just now. Later, I will rush to the left to distract them. You take the opportunity to run out of the forest from the right, and then hide behind the boulder 500 meters away. At most 5 minutes, I will shake off the pursuers and go there to find you." Gesturing, Tang En whispered. Nodding, Lan Sha simply said, "Okay. If you don't arrive in 5 minutes, I will move to the foot of the mountain in front." "Okay." "What is Oku?" After several bargaining arguments, Tang En and Lan Sha reached a consensus that nothing ventured, nothing gained. Of course, Lan Sha also put forward a limit, which was that the number of times they put themselves in danger should not be too many. Once or twice in half a day was enough. This was the best strategy to lure the enemy deep, and Lan Sha had no choice but to concede. Lan Sha was not afraid of risks, otherwise, she would not have taken the initiative to go into the mountain with Tang En to lure the enemy. But this kind of risk must be within her control. Not being surrounded by the pursuers was her bottom line. But Tang En had the ability to accurately control a small range, so he was not afraid of being surrounded by the bushes. In such a situation, his abilities could be put to the best use. In the end, since it was Lan Sha who chose Tang En as his companion, he naturally had to consider Tang En's opinion. Thus, he came up with this compromise. By the time Tang En explained that okay meant okay, no problem, the sparks were already more than 10 steps away. If they walked any further, they would find them hiding behind the tree. Phew! He took a deep breath and exhaled softly. Tang En patted the ancient tree. Amidst the rustling of the leaves, his figure leaped out like lightning. He paused for a moment. "What's that?" "It's them." "Quick, chase after them, chase after them." Call for help, cries of surprise rang out one after another, followed by heavy footsteps. Twain glanced over and saw nearly 100 barbarians rushing towards him with a look of ecstasy on their faces as they swayed their torches. He curled his lips and thought, "Haha, you trash want to keep up with my speed." This was not arrogance. If Tang En was not trying to buy time for Lan Sha to escape, with his speed, the barbarians might not be able to find him even if he flew over their heads. However, just as Tang En was about to underestimate them, suddenly, bang! Ouch! A sound of impact came from behind him, mixed with a short cry of pain. Tang En stopped and turned around in shock. He saw Lan Sha's blurry figure 100 meters away. He was lying on the ground, rubbing his forehead with one hand and covering his mouth with the other. In front of him, a small malnourished tree with thick arms kept swaying and leaves slid down. There was no doubt that he had bumped into it. F***ck. Tang En opened his mouth, but he stood still, completely speechless. At the same time, a thought flashed through his mind. That's right, this girl's eyesight doesn't seem too good. But such a tree was in front of him, and he still bumped into it? How short-sighted must he be? Not only Tang En, but the hundreds of barbarians who were chasing after him were also dumbfounded by this ridiculous scene. They looked at Lan Sha, who had bumped into him. He struggled to get up, shook his head, staggered a few steps, and fell to the ground again. They blinked their eyes and were a little dumbfounded. The night wind blew slightly, and the scene was strangely silent. "You are my F***king sister." Tang En was the first to come back to his senses. He could not help but look up to the sky and sigh. Then, he quickly turned around and ran back. At the same time, Your Highness, Your Highness! Your Highness, quickly surround him. Hundreds of barbarians also came back to their senses. They were very excited when they saw the situation. They stepped forward and surrounded His Highness Lan Shah, who had been looking for him for a long time. Fortunately, Tang En's speed was really amazing. He burst out at full speed, and arrived at Lan Shah's side before the barbarians nearby. Lan Shah's usual calm and wise appearance was nowhere to be seen. His forehead was blue and red, and his eyes were dull. It was obvious that he had not woken up from the strong impact just now. It was a pity that he did not forget to cover his mouth tightly, and did not make any sound. Tang En did not have the time to laugh or be polite. He stretched out his hand and grabbed Lan Shah's collar, and firmly clamped him under his left arm. Then, he turned his right hand and a blood-red dagger lit up. He violently attacked the barbarians in front of him. Although he was carrying a person, Twain's speed did not decrease at all. The barbarians only saw a blur in front of their eyes before Twain instantly closed in on them. Specks of blood flashed and disappeared in a flash. Amidst the miserable cries, flowers of blood bloomed. Damn it! Stop him! Tang En, who had broken out of the encirclement in an instant, swung his dagger and directly cut the culprit, the small tree, in half. Then, he twisted his waist and turned around, lifting his right leg and violently kicking the small tree behind him. Whoosh! Bang bang bang! The tree trunk was not thick, but the strength of Tang En's sidekick was more than 500 kilograms. Dozens of barbarians behind him were instantly knocked to the ground. Although there were no casualties, the barbarians behind them did not have the opportunity to chase after them. Tang En, on the other hand, did not even look at the result of the kick. Clutching Lan Shah, he quickly leaped forward. The previous strategy of creating a diversion was no longer effective. Leaving this place as quickly as possible was the most important thing now. Fortunately, this was only the first experiment, and their current position was at the periphery of the encirclement. Otherwise, if this had happened in the hinterland, no matter how powerful Tang En was, it would not have been easy for him to escape. After running for a few kilometers, Tang En slowed down. He lowered his head and saw Lan Shah's clear eyes looking at him with a frown. He grinned. Big sister, you should have told me earlier that you are short-sighted. I was almost played to death by you. Lan Shah turned his head away when he heard this. He probably knew that he was in the wrong this time, and he looked a little guilty. He paused for a moment and said, short-sighted? Well, I was born with poor eyesight. Also, put me down. Forget it. Tang En shook his head when he heard this. I am afraid of you. Luckily, you hit a small tree this time. If it was a huge rock, I would have to carry a wounded person everywhere. It is not worth it. That tree is too thin, Lan Shah explained weakly. He twisted his body, and his expression was a little unnatural and vaguely humiliated. He said again, put me down. Tang En then realized that their posture was a little ambiguous. Although he had picked up Lan Shah by the waist, in that situation, naturally, it was not very accurate. Only now did he feel that the side of his thumb was a little soft. He moved, and the elastic feeling went straight to the bottom of his heart. Oh, what a nice body! In all honesty, Tang En's action was purely subconscious, or it could be said that it was the residual effect of the evil body state. But the delicate body under his left arm froze in an instant. Then Tang En saw Lan Shah pursing his lips. His expression was calm, but the coldness in his eyes suddenly appeared. He quietly took out a few bright berries from his waist. Cha! With a curse, Tang En hurriedly pushed Lan Shah away. Of course, he used gentle force. Lan Shah steadied herself a few steps away. He squinted his eyes, and there were some dangerous signals in his eyes. Immediately, he raised his hands and Tang En said with an innocent face, "Don't be impulsive. You should know that I didn't mean it. It must have been unintentional before, but it was more difficult to say for the few slight movements just now. Naturally, this could not be hidden from Lan Sha, so she was still quietly staring at Tang En. Her right hand that was holding the few scary berries tightened and loosened in silence. His throat moved. Tang En saw this and suddenly felt that his mouth was a little dry. He awkwardly changed the topic. Well, since you are short-sighted, why don't you wear glasses? After a while, Lan Sha finally put away the berries and asked with a frown, Eyes? What are those? It was unknown whether she was genuinely confused or just wanted to end this awkward scene. However, Tang En naturally took over the topic and said while gesturing, It's 2 concave and convex lenses. Oh, there will be time later. We can replace it with ice cubes. Of course, it melts easily, but it can still magnify the things in front of you in a short time. Seeing that Lan Sha was still frowning, Tang En explained again, Have you noticed that the things under the water droplet will become slightly bigger? You haven't? Well, this is indeed too common and easy to ignore. Tomorrow morning, we can collect some morning dew to try. Think about it, a drop of water can magnify things, then what about ice cubes? Or concave and convex lenses made of transparent crystal? In short, aren't you His Highness? When we go back, we can order people to make it and use more materials. Even if we can't make glasses, magnifying glasses are still not a problem. In order to eliminate the awkwardness, Tang En had to show off some things of the modern world that he only knew a little about to change the topic. However, the effect was very good. Lan Sha seemed to be very attentive to this and asked questions about the details of the production process from time to time. Of course, after all, the two were still in a state of being chased. Now, they were only slightly distancing themselves. When they turned around, they could even see sparks running towards them quickly. Therefore, after a while, the two put aside the issue of glasses and fled forward again. Although the first plan completely failed, it was because of special reasons. Therefore, after distancing themselves for a while, Lan Sha did not refuse Tang En's careful proposal. He chose the terrain again and operated the plan of luring the enemy. Just as mentioned earlier, Tang En's precise control over a small area and Lan Sha's ability to see the big picture and strategize were the most suitable partners. As long as the two sides could be a little more tolerant and trust each other, the power they could exert would undoubtedly be terrifying. Now, perhaps because of the relationship just now, Tang En and Lan Sha seemed to have found some tacit understanding. When they cooperated again, there was a sense of trust. In this way, the tens of thousands of pursuers behind them were undoubtedly in a tragedy. It was not that they could not find Tang En and Lan Sha. In fact, Tang En and Lan Sha took the initiative to appear in front of them from time to time. Sometimes, they were not far away from the encirclement and disappeared in a flash. Sometimes, they were even right under their noses, but in the end, Tang En and Lan Sha always easily broke out of the encirclement. Every time, they were just a little bit away, just a little bit. This distance could even be measured with the eyes. However, the tens of thousands of pursuers who were agitated and anxious couldn't catch up with the two of them. They could only watch them slip away from them, either smoothly or with difficulty. This happened again and again. Although it made the pursuers so depressed that they were about to vomit blood, it also gave them a lot of confidence. They always felt that they would definitely be able to catch the other party next time, or the time after that. Unfortunately, these pursuers did not know that bullfighting was a sport. Otherwise, they would find out how similar this situation was to their current situation. Time and time again, they were so anxious that they were about to go crazy. Time and time again, they mustered up their remaining strength and charged forward. But in the end, they always brushed past their targets. Of course, when they were finally exhausted, they couldn't avoid the fatal sword between their eyebrows. Chapter 6:26. Early in the morning, the grass was barely visible. The wasteland, which had been noisy all night, finally quieted down a little at this moment. This did not mean that the people inside had left, but at a glance, without those messy sparks, it seemed much quieter. Coo coo coo. The early birds also quietly poked their heads out of the forest, looked around, and tried to sound out a few times. Probably because they did not notice any danger in the surroundings, in just a moment, cheerful bird sounds rose and fell one after another. As the saying goes, the early bird gets the worm. Seeing that a new day had arrived, these early birds straightened their feathers and flapped their wings to fly out to look for food. Unfortunately, these diligent mountain birds did not know that there was a saying, "The early bird gets eaten." At this moment, suddenly, whoosh whoosh whoosh. In the corner, 3 oval stones with a sharp sound pierced through the air and disappeared in a flash. It should be said that the sensitivity of all beasts to danger was not low, it was almost instinctive. But now, on the highest branch, 3 larger mountain birds were directly hit by the stones, as if they did not notice. The birds' heads were badly mutilated, and they fell straight down. Whoosh! The other mountain birds reacted quickly. In the blink of an eye, they flapped their wings and flew away, crying out in alarm, and disappeared in an instant. Tsk, standing so high up, don't you know that the bird that sticks out gets shot? Keep a low profile, brother bird. In the midst of the banter, a young man walked out from the corner, stretched out his hand, and yawned loudly. He walked over to pick up the breakfast that would be left behind later. Needless to say, this was naturally Tang En. After a whole night of hide-and-seek chasing, and running at full speed before dawn, they had already arrived at the depths of the wasteland. As for the specific location, Tang En did not know, nor did he care, but seeing that Lan Sha consciously adjusted the direction, he should know. As mentioned before, as long as the two of them worked together, or as long as Lan Sha was willing to cooperate with Tang En, then the two of them did not have to worry about being surrounded and caught. Although he was somewhat unwilling to admit it, Tang En would sometimes think about his journey to the other world and the experience of being chased from time to time. He also felt that his escape experience was probably unparalleled in the world. Carrying the 3 unlucky mountain birds, Tang En walked out of the sparse forest. When he looked up, he saw Lan Sha's figure beside a frozen stream. His back was slightly arched and his head was lowered. He was sitting there quietly, as if he was concentrating on something. Seeing this, Tang En's eyes flickered slightly. He pursed his lips and whistled silently. The word temperament was often mentioned by people. It seemed to be invisible and intangible, but it really existed. Only some of them were covered with a layer of skin, which could be broken with a single poke. There were also some that came from within and were naturally manifested. Thanks to the internet, Tang En had seen many beautiful women in the modern world. Her temperament could be noble and cold, or dignified and elegant, and so on. At that time, Tang En was an out-and-out loser. When he was dazzled, he might say things like, "That's all there is to it," and so on, but in his heart, he did not think of the other person as a goddess, especially when he was dreaming about her at night. But now that he thought about it, when he compared her with this Lan Sha in front of him, who did not show any kind of attitude, well, Tang En had to admit that there was no point in comparing the two of them. Some things were just not there, just like wearing a pair of glasses. It might make a person look more refined, but after talking to each other for a while, one would realize that it was just an illusion. Without seeing the majestic rivers and mountains, without being in a high position, without being able to control the world, without being able to make thousands of warriors rush to their deaths with a single glance, where would the naturally dignified, noble, and elegant temperament of those in power come from? Perhaps conquering such a woman would give him a sense of accomplishment. Bang, bang, bang. Knocking on his forehead, Tang En frowned slightly. His expression was somewhat conflicted. Thinking too much, thinking too much. Evil body, oh evil body, you are evil, not big brother. Tang En dared to guarantee with his moral integrity that this was definitely not his usual way of thinking. Well, at least not completely. Tang En now understood what the old butler meant by a subtle change in personality. After becoming a ghost, he was more bloodthirsty, and after becoming an evil body, his perspective of looking at things had indeed changed. This change could not be considered good. It would not cause his sense of justice to suddenly explode. It could not be considered bad either. He would not think about destroying the world. Instead, it seemed to be closer to doing whatever he wanted, It seemed that it was necessary to find some time to have a good talk with the old butler. After pondering for a while, Tang En shook his head to clear his mind of random thoughts and walked over. As the angle changed, Tang En could clearly see that Lan Sha was staring at a drop of dew on his finger in a daze. He could not help but raise his eyebrows. What could a drop of water see? Molecules, bacteria. Don't mess around. This is an eye, not a microscope. If one did not start from these small points and looked at the big picture, one would find that the things under the drop of water would become bigger. The degree of change might be very slight, but it was indeed so. Obviously, Tang En's words last night had a big impact on Lan Sha. Or rather, Lan Sha's resentment towards his short-sightedness was very deep. Walking a few steps forward, just as Tang En was about to wave his hand and tease him, Lan Sha suddenly flicked his slender fingers and water splashed out. Then he reached into his waist and seemed to take something out. He swung his hand and threw it into the frozen stream not far away. Tang En's eyesight was so good that he instantly saw that it was a dark red berry. Damn, isn't this the exploding fruit? Just as he thought about it, suddenly, boom, ice cubes splashed everywhere and mist rose. The thick layer of ice above the stream instantly exploded, and a hole about 3 feet wide appeared. The sound of flowing water below also became clear in an instant. Tang En couldn't help but grin. Damn, it was impossible to guard against. If someone accidentally ate it, wouldn't their brain explode and they would be lying flat on the ground? Lan Sha got up after the explosion, walked a few steps forward, bent down and picked up a few ice cubes. He squinted his eyes and once again entered the state of research. You can't do this. Tang En walked to the hole and neatly dealt with a few mountain birds without looking back. You have to find some bumpy ice cubes or polish them yourself. Only then can the effect be magnified. Well, if there are 2 convex lenses, even a telescope can be made. A telescope can see far away. Lan Sha tilted his head and analyzed the literal meaning. Of course. Tang En lit a bonfire and placed the 3 mountain birds on a perch. Then, he clapped his hands. Since he had nothing else to do, he pointed to a mountain in the distance and bragged, "Take that mountain peak for example. If you rely on your eyes alone, you naturally won't be able to see what's on it. But if you use a telescope, I guarantee that you can even clearly distinguish what kind of trees are planted there." Lan Sha squinted his eyes and looked at the mountain in a daze. He seemed to be shocked by the effect of Tang En's words. After a while, he turned his head and frowned. This is also Brand's alchemy item? Tang En turned the oily mountain bird and didn't think much about it. He patted his chest and laughed. How is that possible? This is my genius idea. I don't tell ordinary people. Really? Is it real or fake? Tang En raised his head to look at Lan Sha's solemn expression, and his heart skipped a beat. He realized that he had said something wrong and tried to cover it up. Tang En's reaction was not slow, but Lan Sha was not a normal person. She raised her thin eyebrows and looked at Tang En meaningfully. That gaze seemed to have just met him. Tang En's expression did not change, but he secretly complained in his heart. Because he had already figured out where the problem was. Lan Sha was not a pampered aristocrat. Looking at how easily she had commanded more than 10,000 barbarians to fight, and then thinking about her amazing performance during the negotiation not long ago, he knew that she was not only ambitious, but also full of ambition. Such a strange woman. After knowing the function of the telescope, how could she not know the important role of this item on the battlefield? Tangan was also careless just now. He was preparing breakfast and thinking about the influence of the evil body. He accidentally told her everything about the telescope. Sure enough, after narrowing her eyes, Lan Sha took a deep breath and decisively waved her hand. Mr. Arthur, as long as you can make the telescope, the antidote is not a problem. Moreover, I think I will now decide to recruit you. I just said it casually. Also, don't fool me. You promised me the antidote before. Those are two different things. Okay, then what do you need? Status, fame, wealth, women, or other things? When we reach the Imperial City, I can give you all these. When we go back to Bran. Oh, you think I will let you go back and make a telescope to use on my northern wilderness tribes? Then I'm sorry, I'm not interested in these. Well, then I'm sorry to tell you that the antidote is gone. TSK, don't go too far. To be blunt, your life is now in my hands. Mr. Arthur, you overestimate yourself and underestimate me. I admit that I can't beat you, but at least I have the ability to end my own life. Of course, then your antidote will be gone. Oh, you dare to threaten me? Little girl, you can try. Then come at me. Come at me. Come at me. For a moment, Tang En and Lan Sha were a few steps away from each other, staring at each other. The smell of barbecued meat wafted through the air, and the scene suddenly became a bit of a stalemate. The degree of need determined the value. If it was 2 years ago, Tang En would never have thought that he would be a third-rate student who copied and sent 200 applications without any news. There would be a day when he was valued so much that he would not hesitate to restrict his freedom. Damn it! After a while, the quarrel was fruitless. Of course, both sides did not touch each other's bottom line. Even if their voices were getting louder and louder, and their spittle was about to hit each other's faces, they did not choose to make things difficult. The thing that Lan Sha wanted was in Tang En's mind. It could be said that unless Tang En was willing, no one could take it away. On the other hand, Tang En's life was in Lan Sha's hands. He naturally thought of capturing and interrogating him, but Tang En knew that since this woman dared to untie the chains, and even ran away with him, she was naturally fully prepared in this regard. Just like what Lan Sha said just now, she at least had the ability to end his life. Letting out a long breath, Tang En narrowed his long and narrow eyes, and simply sat back beside the bonfire. Let's eat first. At this time, at the tribe's gathering place. If one wanted to count the number of tribes around here, perhaps even the dominant barbarian bear tribe could not do it. It was not that they could not count, but the key was that there were not many good tribes, so most of the tribes migrated all year round. After a long time, naturally no one was willing to do such a laborious and thankless job. At this moment, a large number of people from each tribe walked out. However, this time it was not a collective migration, but a glorious banner of revenge. That's right, Lan Sha's hidden hand was playing a role. In the early morning, after the barbarian bear tribe sent out nearly 5,000 people, the tribe's gathering place was like a calm lake that suddenly had a boulder thrown into it, suddenly setting off waves. Then, as if by agreement, the large and small tribes continued to send out more or less troops, and all of them were personally led by their respective patriarchs. If a void-level cultivator passed by here and looked down from above, they would find this quite a spectacular scene. The men and horses of the various tribes were like small streams gushing out from all over the place. Once they met, they would quickly merge and finally merge into the largest troop. They converged into a river and roared as they pushed forward, as if they wanted to directly rush into the river and sea. Of course, there were no void-level cultivators passing by here, but there were more than a dozen uninvited guests rushing over. Just from the speed at which they were running, it was clear that none of these people were ordinary. Soon, after climbing to the top of a hill, the dozen people saw the spectacular scene in front of them and could not help but stop. Damn it! The prince was right, that little brat Anna can't deal with Lan Sha. The leader was a white-haired old man with an ugly expression. Even though he looked old, His bulging muscles looked like they were cast from iron, causing people to be intimidated by him. "Old Lay, why do you say that?" A middle-aged barbarian walked out and looked at the dense crowd of people in the distance, and asked in confusion. The white-haired old man called Old Lay had a gloomy expression as he pointed down the mountain. "Idiot, that little brat Anna brought more than 10,000 people here to deal with His Highness Lord Shah. Why would he need reinforcements? Pause for a while. Look, there are at least 30,000 people here. Anna must have screwed up, giving Lord Shah the opportunity to mobilize so many people." Old Lay's analysis was very reasonable, and the middle-aged barbarian immediately nodded and asked, "Then what do we do now? With just our people, it's impossible to resist so many soldiers." "Not necessarily." After a moment of silence, Old Lay's eyes flashed. "At least we came at a good time. These tribes have clearly just been mobilized, we still have a chance." "Then what are we waiting for? Let's hurry up and catch up." "All right. Old Lay, since we are already here, when we meet His Highness Lord Shah, how should we deal with him?" "It's best if we capture him alive." The person who asked the question was somewhat hesitant, but Old Lay seemed to have a plan and said unhurriedly, "The situation in the Imperial City is not optimistic. We have underestimated Her Majesty. So if we can capture Lord Shah, we can take the initiative. It's a pity that Tu went to the front lines and was captured by the Bran. Otherwise, our chances would be even greater." Shaking his head, Old Lay revealed a look of regret, but it disappeared in an instant. His old eyes flashed with a ruthless look. "Of course, His Highness Lord Shah's schemes are unparalleled, and he has André and more than 20 personal guards by his side. His strength is in no way inferior to ours. So, everyone must not be careless. If the situation does not allow it, we can still send Lord Shah's corpse to the Imperial City." Hiss! The moment these words were said, the whistling cold wind was immediately mixed with the sound of cold gasp. Even though these people had extraordinary strength, they could not help but feel their cheeks twitch when they heard this, and they fell silent for a moment. Right at this moment, a clear voice suddenly resounded. "There's someone on the left." The one who spoke was a man wearing a black robe, and half of his face was covered. He was standing at the back, in the corner, and was very inconspicuous. It was as if he had intentionally separated himself from the 10 or so experts of the northern wilderness. Hearing this, everyone immediately came back to their senses and turned their heads. Indeed, not far from the left side of the hill, they saw about 300 people rushing over. They probably did not discover them, but just happened to pass by. Branby, people sneaky. Although it was the black-robed man who reminded him, the middle-aged barbarian clearly did not appreciate this kindness. He curled his lips, and his expression was full of disdain. If Old Lay had not turned around to glare at him, he would probably have said some insulting words. Hearing this, the black-robed man's robe fluttered slightly, and the brim of his hat slowly lifted. A cold silver light flashed, and then it was lowered. It was a very slight movement, but the middle-aged barbarian only felt a cold, murderous intention in an instant. It was as if he had fallen into an ice-house. Thump, thump, thump. He subconsciously took a few steps back, and almost fell off the mountain peak. Having made such a big fool of himself, the middle-aged barbarian's face suddenly turned green and red. He suddenly took a step forward, and a lion-like black gas violently rushed out of his body. "You're courting death, enough!" Old Lay shouted angrily, and stood between the two barbarians. His face was ashen. "Don't forget that we're here to do business. If we delay the prince's important matter, everyone will die." The black gas gradually dispersed. Humph! The middle-aged barbarian was obviously unwilling, but after hearing this, he did not dare to be too presumptuous. In the end, he could only glare at the black-robed man with a murderous intention. On the other hand, the black-robed man was very calm. He stood there quietly, and did not even lift the brim of his hat. He completely ignored the barbarian's actions. It had to be said that this attitude undoubtedly made the middle-aged barbarian more angry, and his fists were tightly clenched. He believed that if old Lay did not stand in the middle, he would have already rushed over. The other experts stood on the side, and most of them had a look of ridicule on their faces. It seemed that they were accustomed to this scene, and were clearly enjoying the show. However, their attitude showed that they were on the middle-aged barbarian's side, and that they were eager to teach the black-robed man a lesson. "All right." Old Lay frowned after he had temporarily suppressed the situation. It seemed that this matter was giving him a headache. Finally, he simply pointed at the small group of barbarians on the left side of the hill. "Kill them quickly. Leave one alive for questioning." His voice had barely faded. "Roar!" The sullen middle-aged barbarian roared, and the black gas around him was released again. He was the first one to rush down. It was obvious that he wanted to vent his anger on these people. The other experts, including the black-robed man, also rushed down one after another. There was a big gap between an expert and an ordinary soldier. As long as there was not an absolute suppression in terms of numbers, there was no suspense in the slaughter. After a moment, a loud blood-curdling screech resounded. Chapter 6:27. He had rushed over to vent his anger, but he ended up kicking a steel plate instead. In just a short moment, 2 experts from the northern wilderness were killed by the black-robed man. They were still running in the wilderness. The commotion was fleeting, so it naturally didn't attract anyone's attention. Just as the middle-aged barbarian had said, there were no outsiders here, so no one would know what had happened. It was a pity that even though he had a good plan, he ended up being the victim of his own cleverness. Silently, he and his companions had lost their lives for nothing. Looking away, Tangan was still sprinting ahead. His speed and agility were indeed not something an ordinary expert could compare to. The complicated terrain was not enough to stop him from moving forward. Even if Elder Lay reacted in time, it didn't have any effect. He could only fall behind, helplessly chasing further and further away. Among them, the black-robed man was the fastest, and it was obvious that he was holding back, just like how he had hidden his strength before. But even so, the black-robed man looked at the blurry figure in front of him that didn't slow down at all. He couldn't help but shake his head and sigh at his inferiority. This speed was a bit abnormal. Seeing this, Elder Lay and the others had a feeling in their hearts. No wonder Anna and the others couldn't catch Lan Shah. With this speed, if the other party didn't deliberately go easy on them, ordinary soldiers wouldn't even be able to catch up to him. About half an hour had passed, and everyone had noticed a mountain peak right in front of them. It couldn't be helped. This mountain peak was too eye-catching. Not only was it tall, but it also covered a large area. Looking up, the peak of the mountain almost reached the clouds, like a natural barrier. "We're here." Tangan's long and narrow eyes narrowed as he scanned the surroundings. He couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. "Where are the reinforcements you mentioned? Haven't they arrived yet?" This was the cliff that Lan Shah had mentioned before. She was also observing the surroundings, especially the south. Looking up at the sky, she said, "It's about time. Let's go to the foot of the mountain first. Even if the main force hasn't arrived yet, there should be scouts from various tribes choosing an ambush spot there." "Okay." Tangan took a deep breath. Suddenly, he raised his head and let out a long howl. His voice reverberated for miles. Then, his figure sped up again. Like a wild horse that had broken free of its reins, he headed straight for the mountain peak. This long howl was not for nothing. Firstly, it was to point out a path for the pursuers behind, so that they would not be left behind due to their speed. Secondly, if there was really someone at the foot of the mountain, they would come over to patrol after hearing the commotion. This way, they wouldn't have to waste time looking for him after they arrived at the foot of the mountain. As expected, When Tang En was about to rush to the foot of the mountain, several figures quickly greeted him. They also looked familiar. They were the experts from the original small caravan, Lan Shah's personal guards. However, as they approached, they saw the noble His Highness Lan Shah lying on the back of a bran. Their bodies trembled and their brains almost crashed. What kind of situation was this? Seeing this, Lan Shah's eyes flickered slightly, and an imperceptible shyness flashed by. Then, he put on a dignified face and asked directly, "Where is he?" At the back." Hearing this, Lan Shah could not help but frown. "Give me more details." Taking a deep breath, an expert from the caravan gradually calmed down. He bowed and said, "Captain, the reinforcements are about 5 miles to the south. There are nearly 60,000 people rushing over." Nodding, Lan Shah muttered to himself for a few seconds. Then, he decisively ordered, "Cancel all the previous ambush plans. When the 60,000 people arrive here, 10,000 of them will climb the mountain from the south. They will form a defensive line halfway up the mountain under my command. The other 50,000 will face the southeast and set up the wild goose wing formation. They will take down the 10,000 or so traitors." "Yes." After roughly explaining the battle strategy, Lan Shah lowered his head and whispered in Tang En's ear, "Then it's settled. We will climb the mountain from the east." No problem." Tilting his head, Tang En's long hair that hung down on his head tickled his ears. Of course, he could see Lan Shah's predicament, but the situation was urgent, so he did not have the mood to tease him. He said to the experts from the caravan, "Run, there are more than 10 experts coming this way." After saying this, he stepped past them like a ghost and rushed to the east of the mountain. Hearing this, they turned around in a daze and looked at the two people's backs as they left. Then, they saw Lan Shah's hand covering his thigh. For a moment they only felt that it was extremely dazzling. It was like a drop of black ink on a sacred snow lotus. Dirty, blasphemous, and other words kept rolling in their minds. This damned Bran. Of course, Tang En did not know what the people behind him were thinking. Otherwise, he would have taken the time to come over and teach them a lesson. "Do you think it is easy for me to work like a horse and tire myself to death? It's fine if you don't appreciate my help, but you still think of me as a pervert? Is there still any King law?" But the next scene showed that these people did not actually wrongly accuse Tang En previously, when they were running on flat ground. Although Tang En and Lan Shah's bodies came into contact several times, they did not clearly feel that anything was wrong. Now that they started to climb the mountain, everything was different. In order to avoid the jagged rocks and accurately find a foothold, the two people's bodies began to inevitably rise, fall and touch almost every time they jumped. Tang En could clearly feel the softness on his back pressing against him. He could not help but think of the towering peaks, so they kept changing shape, flattening, bouncing up, and pressing down again. He had to admit that Tang En's mind was wandering at this moment. He condemned the remnant thoughts of the evil body at the same time. This rhythm would lead a decent person astray. At the same time, he secretly compared the figures of Lan Shah and Sylvia in his mind. Well, although he did not see it with his own eyes, Lan Shah seemed to be a little bigger. Cough, cough, as expected of someone from the northern wilderness. On the other side, Lan Shah naturally sensed this as well. Even with her monstrous intelligence, she was still caught off guard by this foreign domain. The embarrassment she had just suppressed surged up, and her jade-like face instantly flushed red. Moreover, she could not blame anyone for this. Tang En was running with her on his back, and this was a normal body collision. Even in some dangerous places, when Tang En needed to free his hands, she had to take the initiative to tighten her slender jade legs and wrap them tightly around Tang En's waist. The strange rocks and ancient trees quickly fell from their line of sight. Neither of them spoke as they ran, and the atmosphere was especially awkward for a moment. At this moment, the dozen or so experts chasing them finally arrived at the foot of the mountain. At this time, The tribe's reinforcements had not yet arrived, and the surroundings were silent. Old Lei and the others did not suspect anything. They looked up at the faintly discernible figures of Tang En and Lan Sha, and quickly climbed the mountain to catch up. Their only doubt was that the few people who had seen the middle-aged barbarian's movements first looked around and did not notice their arrival. In the end, they could only shrug their shoulders and assume that the other party was arranging funeral arrangements somewhere and had not yet arrived. Of course, no one thought that the black-robed man could win. After all, Old Lei was the strongest here, and the others were basically on par. Thus, in a 2-on-1 situation, the black-robed man's fate could be imagined. But what they did not know was that a few minutes later, the black-robed man with a leisurely expression suddenly came out from behind an ancient tree not far away. It was obvious that he had been here for a long time, even faster than Old Lei. It was just that now was not a good time to meet, so he deliberately slowed down a step. After these experts went up the mountain, the tribe's reinforcements arrived in a grandiose manner. Because they had received the news in advance, everyone quietly came to the south of the mountain. Since this mountain was called the Ultimate Cliff, there was naturally a reason for it. It was called the Ultimate Cliff because in terms of height and area, this mountain far surpassed the surrounding mountains. It could be said that it outshone the others, and it was called the Ultimate Cliff because the north of the mountain was a vertical cliff, like an abyss that had split open the earth. Clouds lingered around it, and no one knew how deep it was or what was below. Now that the tribe's reinforcements had arrived at the south of the mountain, because of the area, they did not disturb Tang En and the others who were climbing up from the east. Then, the team dispersed, led by thousands of barbarians holding the banner of the barbarian bear tribe. About 10,000 people began to climb the mountain. Although the composition of these 10,000 people was complicated, they were the elites of various tribes. It was mainly because the few guards had heard that more than 10 experts were chasing after them and were worried about Lan Sha's safety. Then, the remaining 50,000 people followed Lan Sha's instructions and came to the southeast of the mountain. They spread out their long wings and sent out scouts, quietly waiting for the 10,000 or so rebels to crash into them. However, the first battle did not come from the foot of the mountain, but from the middle of the mountain. Tang En and Lan Sha did not go straight to the top of the mountain. Halfway there, they saw people moving at the foot of the mountain and decisively moved parallel to it, rushing to the south of the mountain. At this time, the 10,000 soldiers had not reached the middle of the mountain, but it was enough. Tang En reluctantly put down Lan Sha and felt the greasy skin on his palm disappear. He could not help but smack his lips, feeling quite regretful. Humph! Lan Sha could guess what Tang En was thinking. She could not help but snort coldly. Then, after touching the ground, she took a step forward and pulled up her fox fur clothes to cover her crimson jade face. Tang En naturally did not care about such a small threat. Because of the angle, he was looking at Lan Sha's delicate red earlobe. He could feel her embarrassment and could not help but raise the corner of his mouth, silently revealing a hateful smile. Haha, although this girl is so powerful that it makes people feel hateful, she is still quite cute. This awkward atmosphere was maintained until several experts of the caravan arrived. Among them were the few people just now. As soon as they arrived, they clenched their fists and stared at Tang En. Their gazes were very unfriendly. Ahem. After a few coughs, Lan Sha drew their attention. Her tone was as calm as ever. Spread out the troops and surround the east side of the mountain. Be sure to annihilate them all. Yes. A caravan expert immediately rushed down the mountain and passed on the order. Looking down at the soldiers in the southeast, Lan Sha waved her hand and said, "Pass down the order. Make the 2 flanks bigger and try to swallow the other side as soon as possible. In addition, prepare 3,000 reserve troops on the periphery and provide support at any time." Yes. Tang En was like an outsider at this time. He stood quietly on the side and watched Lan Sha give out a series of orders in an orderly manner. He could not help but touch his nose and feel a little emotional. According to what Lan Sha said before, this was the second time she really led an army. But now, Tang En did not see any nervousness in her at all. On the contrary, Lan Sha was like a veteran general who had been on the battlefield many times. She was calm and composed when giving orders. It had to be said that sometimes the heavens and the gods were quite unfair. Things like talent really could not be envied. Shaking his head, Tang En's heart suddenly moved. He thought that if Lan Sha was the child of Zi and the Northern Wilderness Empress, then there was nothing to say. After all, her genes were really good. At this moment, suddenly, whoosh! Shouts of killing began to come from the east side of the mountain. The war had finally begun. Chapter 6:28. Elder Lei and the others knew about the existence of reinforcements from the tribes. Not long ago they had slaughtered hundreds of people, but they did not know that this was where the enemy had launched their attack. After chasing for a while, they were wondering how Tang En and his companion had suddenly disappeared. However, they suddenly discovered that there were many soldiers rushing to kill them from far and near. Only then did they realize that the situation was not good. However, it was too late for them to retreat. Their path down the mountain had been cut off, and they were completely surrounded. What was worse was that because they had been scattered, they could not gather together to break out of the encirclement. They could only fight on their own, and their chances of survival were slim. Of course, these people were all experts. Therefore, even if they were surrounded by the elite soldiers of the tribes, they would not be able to finish them off in a short time. The tone of the battle here had been set from the beginning to be a war of attrition, so they could ignore it for the time being. However, hearing the sounds of killing, the experts of the caravan looked at each other and bowed. "Captain, this place is too dangerous. We should escort you down the mountain first." Shaking his head, Lan Sha narrowed his eyes and looked toward the southeast. "No rush. The situation is not stable yet. This place is high above the ground and is a good place to command." This was the truth. In terms of numbers, the army at the foot of the mountain outnumbered the Na rebels by several times. However, one should not forget that the soldiers here were gathered from many tribes. Not to mention the tacit understanding between them, there might even be grudges in the past. In this way, if they were not careful, it was not impossible for the enemy to defeat them. The experts of the caravan had no choice but to send people down to gather all their companions and transfer hundreds of elite soldiers to build a stable defensive line around them. While waiting, the experts of the caravan from before were still staring at Tang En with unfriendly eyes, as if they were considering whether to kill this Bran who had blasphemed their highness, in order to prevent bad news from spreading. "TCH still looking? Bite me if you have the ability." Tang En grinned and glanced at them disdainfully. Then, under the indignant gazes of the experts, he walked to the east to see the miserable state of the experts who had chased after them. Of course, time was still short, and Tang En's thoughts were undoubtedly wishful thinking. The situation was still in a stalemate. A few miles away, on the mountainside, there were 7 or 8 places where all kinds of colorful gases were running rampant. The surrounding rocks and trees would shatter upon contact. It was truly an astonishing power. Under the continuous assault of the elite soldiers of the various tribes, the only thing the experts could do was to retreat step by step. However, they had not suffered any casualties yet. On the contrary, as soon as the tribal soldiers entered the black gas, they were immediately thrown out. Some of them were body parts, while some of them were still intact, but they could only roll down the slope. Among them, Tang En noticed a black-robed man at first glance. This didn't mean that he was extremely powerful, but that his fighting style was clearly different from other northern wilderness experts. As mentioned before, the northern wilderness tribes also had combat energy and magic. However, For the sake of balance, the gods of creation gave the people of the northern wilderness an insanely strong physique. On the other hand, they took away some of their martial arts talent. Therefore, most of the northern wilderness people's achievements in combat energy and magic were limited. Their high-end martial arts were obviously weaker than the Brands. As a result, the northern wilderness simply blazed a new trail, deriving a different set of cultivation methods from various magical beasts. Subsequently, the wilderness cult was born. Of course, Tang En wasn't clear on how the experts of the northern wilderness cultivated. All he could see was that when the northern wilderness experts fought, the various colored substances that resembled combat energy gushed out of their bodies and transformed into all kinds of ferocious magical beasts. For example, when André released his power, the black gas transformed into a single-horned magical beast that resembled a rhinoceros. The many northern wilderness experts before him were the same. There were lions, tigers, snakes, eagles. There were so many of them. Among them, lions were the most numerous. Perhaps because their techniques came from the same source, there were about 5 or 6 people who all transformed into ferocious lions. When they clawed, their power was no weaker than combat energy. Among them, there was a white-haired old man who was the strongest. The lion he transformed into was also the most lifelike, almost solid. It was also because of this that the faint silver glow of the black-robed man became the most eye-catching among them. The silver glow didn't transform into any magical beast. On the contrary, it was extremely pure, just like combat energy? Brand's people? After a moment of shock, Tang En instantly reacted. He couldn't help but shake his head and laugh. His first impression was that the other party was a barbarian from the northern wilderness. He didn't expect the pure combat energy to be from the Brand's people. This didn't mean that no one in the northern wilderness cultivated pure combat energy. It was just that although the black-robed man's face couldn't be seen due to his clothes, judging from his slender and thin body, he didn't look like a barbarian. Narrowing his eyes, this strength. Earth-level beginner? Tisk tisk. Smacking his lips, Tang En shook his head and thought to himself, with such high strength, he still came to this godforsaken place to be a traitor. He really has no future. But Tang En immediately thought that if his identity was exposed, he wouldn't be able to find a place to stay in the Bran. He couldn't help but feel dispirited. Sylvia should be returning to the Bran soon. But it's not a big problem that she doesn't know my name and real appearance. With such a messy thought, Tang En didn't pay attention to the black-robed man anymore. He looked around and lifted his hand. A dagger formed by pure blood appeared out of thin air, but it instantly collapsed and disappeared into the whistling cold wind. This was the Empyrean blood blade skill. Tang En had been practicing it recently when he had nothing to do. Although he didn't succeed, he still had some experience. Vaguely, he seemed to have touched the threshold. Of course, it was hard to say whether it was an illusion or not. Under Tang En's observation, the battle situation didn't change significantly. The masters were still strong, and the soldiers were still attacking. If there were no accidents, the outcome would only be determined after these masters were exhausted. But the result would naturally be the soldiers' victory. It was just a matter of how long it would take and how many casualties there would be. This was the so-called, no matter how high one's martial arts were, they were still afraid of a kitchen knife. No matter how strong one was in a one-on-one battle, they would still be defeated by a group of people. But as he glanced around, Tang En frowned and looked back at the black-robed man again. It wasn't that Tang En felt something was wrong. It was just that among the many sub-battlefields, only the black-robed man didn't retreat. Instead, he silently moved a few hundred meters forward. To be honest, this wasn't easy to do. Even the white-haired old barbarian, who was the strongest among them, had only managed to push 100 meters forward with great difficulty. He was still being suppressed by the barbarians. After observing carefully again, Tang En nodded thoughtfully. It turned out that although the black-robed man's strength wasn't the strongest, his fighting style was quite clever. He didn't fight head-on like the white-haired old barbarian and the others. Instead, he relied on his body movement to attack. Most of the time, he would only injure but not kill. This allowed him to move forward easily. Seeing this, Tang En couldn't help but sigh. Haha, why else would people say that the people of the northern wilderness are stubborn, and the people of the Bran are smart? This is an example. And a hero with a broken arm. After observing carefully, Tang En found that the black-robed man who moved freely seemed to have both hands, just like an ordinary person. But in fact, his bulging left sleeve was empty. It was only supported by fighting energy, and there was no left arm at all. It seems like the people of the Bran, silver fighting energy, missing left arm. Scratching his head, Tang En suddenly had a familiar feeling. It was faint, but he couldn't get rid of it. What's going on? Have I seen him before? That can't be. This is the northern wilderness at this moment. Kill, kill, kill. The earth-shattering battle cry and the sound of weapons clashing instantly came from the foot of the mountain, resounding through the sky. Deep in thought, Tang En frowned and looked up. He saw a black mass of people fighting fiercely in the southeast direction of the mountain. Although he couldn't see clearly, the tragic smell of blood instantly rose to the sky, stirring people's hearts. Needless to say, it was the tens of thousands of traitors who had finally arrived. This Anna was either courageous or, as Lan Sha had expected, his personality was prone to extremes. Anna naturally knew that the reinforcements from the tribe had entered the mountain on a large scale. And even if he didn't receive the news due to some special reasons, because of the sudden appearance of more than 10 masters, he didn't have time to set up an ambush. In other words, Anna's scouts would definitely be able to detect the situation here. But even so, he still led the soldiers to charge here. With such a crazy move, it was hard to guess whether his confidence was bursting, or his stupidity suddenly exploded, causing his brain to suddenly short-circuit. Suddenly, with this interruption, Tang En's feeling of déjà vu toward the black-robed man undoubtedly faded a little. Shaking his head, he gathered the blood blade in his hand again, and walked toward Lan Sha. Chapter 629. At a distance of about 100 meters, Twain's gaze was fixed on the battle at the foot of the mountain. His hands were constantly assembling and dispersing the blood blade. His mind was wandering as he thought about the black-robed man from before. The battle at the foot of the mountain had reached its climax almost immediately. Although Na's personality was prone to extremes, it was undeniable that he had military talent. Now that he had clearly seen the weakness of the temporarily assembled forces, he immediately raised his hand and charged straight into the middle of the army. It was obvious that he wanted to take advantage of the fact that they had yet to stabilize themselves. The current battle situation was indeed as such. More than 10,000 rebel soldiers charged into the middle of the Wild Goose Formation, completely disregarding the danger of being surrounded. They pushed forward step by step and charged straight into the middle of the army at the foot of the mountain. As the saying goes, one needs a heavy hammer to beat the drum. The rebel soldiers' barbaric and unreasonable fighting style instantly exposed the weakness of the middle of the army. Although there were 50,000 soldiers from each tribe and they had an absolute advantage, from the current situation, it looked like the enemy had the upper hand in terms of numbers. The middle of the army was retreating step by step, and the situation was precarious. Seeing this, Tang En raised his eyebrows and walked to Lan Sha's side. "How is it? Can you handle it? If Na chooses to avoid the brunt of the attack, and I can't stay here for long, it will indeed be a little troublesome. But now..." Lan Sha turned to look at Tang En, his expression calm. "It's not a big problem." "Oh!" He waved his hand and pointed down the mountain. "Although these 10,000 rebel soldiers are at their peak, they won't last long. I deliberately let them pass through the middle of the mountain. Once they completely enter, the two wings will quickly close in. At that time we will see the result. Tisk, that's easy to understand. But Tang Yen glanced at the calm Lan Sha and laughed. Haha, aren't you worried that the enemy will directly break through the army's morale? Haha, that's impossible. Lan Sha also chuckled, somewhat mockingly. He narrowed his eyes and said, because they don't even know where I am. Tang Yen was stunned when he heard this. When he came back to his senses, he couldn't help but shake his head and laugh. Yes, because of the sudden appearance of more than 10 experts, they were already halfway up the mountain. Anna naturally didn't know about this. Right now, he was leading his troops to attack fiercely towards the rear of the central army. Naturally, he thought that Lan Sha was there. That's right. Usually, when two armies faced off against each other, their commanders would be there. But Lan Sha just happened to be on the mountain right now. In other words, Anna had chosen the wrong target from the very beginning when he led more than 10,000 rebels to fight to the death. Under such circumstances, if Anna wanted to win and successfully capture Lan Sha, he would have to kill all 50,000 soldiers here. It had to be said that this was simply a tragedy. Just like in an archery competition, if one party mistook the other party's target for their own, then the outcome would naturally be self-evident. Realizing this, Tang Yen looked down at the tens of thousands of rebel soldiers and could not help but sigh. This Anna. He is really an honest person. As the saying went, walking the same path to the end was just like this. There is a certain element of gambling in war, but wanting to win by gambling alone is undoubtedly laughable. Lan Sha narrowed her eyes and looked towards the center of the rebel army. Of course, with her eyesight she naturally couldn't see it, but Anna was definitely there. Only an armchair strategist would make such a low-level mistake. Master and Shuai has been wise all his life, but perhaps he has made a mistake in protecting his juniors too much. He has harmed Anna and the tens of thousands of warriors. Tang Yen shrugged and laughed disapprovingly. Worry for nothing. Since the other party is determined to kill you, it's only natural that you kill them back. Shaking her head slightly, Lan Sha seemed to disagree with this statement, but there was indeed no need to explain too much. Seeing that the rebel soldiers had not completely entered the encirclement, she asked casually, "You just went to the eastern mountain peak. What's the situation there?" "What else can it be? They're all experts, it's impossible to take them down in a short time. It's like when you surrounded us in the Forbidden Valley." Tang Yen also replied casually, but then he touched his forehead. "Oh right, there's also something strange. There are quite a few Bran experts in your tribe?" Lan Sha turned her head in surprise. "Why, is there a Bran among the people chasing after you?" "Yes, and one with a broken arm." Nodding, Lan Sha looked at Tang Yen thoughtfully. "There are indeed quite a few Bran people in the tribe. Most of them fled here after committing crimes on your side. For example, you were chased by people from the Temple of Light. Since you can escape, it means that you're extraordinary. So, as long as you don't do anything outrageous in the northern wilderness, the tribes will naturally try to recruit you." Pause for a while, then said, "Of course, after all, you're from the Bran. It's not suitable for people like you to appear in the northern wilderness, so most of the people who are recruited are either strategists or simply trained to be guards or assassins. But you don't have to do this. As long as you can make a telescope, I naturally have a way to let you enjoy a noble status in the northern wilderness." Touching his nose, Tang Yen glanced at the shocked expressions of the experts beside him, and said, "We've discussed this topic before, I'm not interested in this." "Don't rush to refuse." Shaking his head slightly, Lan Sha said calmly, "I just want to tell you that as long as you agree, any conditions that are not too excessive can be discussed." Do you know that Bran expert just now? Although he has committed a heinous crime, I can spare his life on account of you." Tang Yen was stunned when he heard this, and quickly waved his hand. You've really misunderstood. I don't know him, he kept muttering, but a flash of lightning suddenly flashed across his brain. Then, Tang En's expression suddenly changed, and he grabbed his hair with both hands and squatted down, frowning. Wait, let me think. Temple of Light's Pursuit. Brand silver fighting aura, broken left arm. More than 10,000 rebel soldiers at the foot of the mountain had completely entered the encirclement, and they were still pushing forward with unstoppable force. Lan Sha, who was supposed to give orders, turned around in surprise and looked at Tang En, who was extremely confused, and his thin eyebrows could not help but slowly frown. One day and one night was not too long, but in the process of being constantly pursued, Lan Sha of course knew what kind of ability the brand beside him had. Unfathomable strength, precise control over a small area, and creative inventions that were strange but practical. To be honest, Lan Sha was indeed shocked. Otherwise, with her status, why would she keep arguing with the other party over the recruitment issue? But now, this guy who took the initiative to enter the encirclement of more than 10,000 people, and then came out with ease, actually had such an expression on his face in an instant, and there was even a faint hint of fear. This naturally made Lan Sha particularly puzzled, and he paid special attention to it. Suddenly, Tang En, who was squatting and thinking hard, suddenly stood up, holding his forehead, and his expression was distorted. Isn't this King Yema? Yema. Lan Sha raised his eyebrows. Who is this? This is... Before Tang En could explain, suddenly, boom, a violent explosion suddenly came from afar. When everyone turned their heads, they saw a silver light pillar shooting up to the sky from the east, domineering and awe-inspiring. CK. If he was a little uncertain or unwilling to be sure just now, looking at this attack that was obviously not from a beginner Earth stage warrior, Tang En no longer had any doubts. He quickly reached out and grabbed Lan Sha's shoulder, and his figure quickly retreated. Run! The surrounding experts of the caravan regained their senses at this warning, and before they could understand what was going on, they saw that Highness Lan Sha had been taken away by Tang En, and hurriedly chased after him in shock. Damn it, what are you doing? Put him down! Put your sister down! Tang En did not even turn his head, and his figure flashed out like a ghost. King, turn around and look. Hearing this, the experts of the caravan subconsciously turned around, and their bodies suddenly trembled, and their eyes widened. Not far from the east, as soon as the silver light pillar disappeared, they saw a black-robed person standing in the air, slowly rising into the air. And the instant they looked over, the black-robed person seemed to have sensed something and turned his head to look over. Whoosh, the hood was blown off by the cold wind, and a head of long silver hair fluttered wantonly in the wind. Probably because he had discovered his target, the black-robed person's mouth curled into a sneer, and then his slowly rising figure suddenly floated in a straight line, floating in the air. A void stage warrior? This was obvious. Everyone knew that, other than mages, only warriors above the void stage could fly freely in the sky. Realizing this, the experts of the caravan gasped in unison, and as they looked at each other, their brains went numb. Not daring to say anything more, they turned around and ran wildly. At this moment, it was not only Tang En and the others who were equally shocked. In fact, even Elder Lei and the others who came looked at the black-robed person floating in the air in a daze, speechless for a long time. Of course, they knew that the other party was one of the brand's people, but they did not know that the other party's strength was actually so high. Otherwise, even if the middle-aged barbarian had eaten a bear's heart and a leopard's guts, he would not have dared to provoke them so arrogantly. And some of the insiders finally understood why the middle-aged barbarian and his companion had disappeared in horror when they reflected on whether they had offended the other party before. Previously, they had thought that the other party had accidentally died in battle, but now looking at the black-robed person floating in the air, there was no doubt that they understood. Who? Seeing the black-robed person disappear on the other side of the mountain, Elder Lay took a deep breath and suddenly jumped out with a roar. Gather here and kill! It had to be said that while everyone on the mountain was shocked by the black-robed person's strength, it undoubtedly gave Elder Lay and the other experts an opportunity. Of course, escaping down the mountain was undoubtedly impossible. Now they could only gather together and kill in the direction where the black-robed person disappeared to have a chance of completing the mission and successfully escaping. At this time, needless to say, the black-robed person was naturally Yema. In fact, generally speaking, Yema was a typical example of a person with a bad fate. After the battle with Zhuofan and the threshold of the void level, he immediately ran to the deep mountains and forests to fight with various demon beasts, hoping to make a breakthrough in the battle. But what happened next made him completely at a loss. He just felt that it was a little strange that Sang Pu and the others did not come back to look for demon beasts with him for a long time. So, when Yema came out of the deep mountains and forests, he was shocked to find that he had become a leader without an army and was a national wanted criminal. In anger, he went to seek revenge, but inexplicably, he was hit by the sword of a low-level thief and was seriously injured. Then, before his injury was healed, the people of the Temple of Light came to find him. After a fierce battle, he lost his left arm and fled to the northern wilderness. Such a tragic experience, just listening to it would make one's face fill with tears. Needless to say, the person involved was Yema. There was no need to elaborate on what happened after that. After escaping to the northern wilderness, Yema knew that he would not be able to return to Bulan for the time being. Coincidentally, he met a big shot who invited him to the Battle Lions tribe. Bounty hunters were a profession that prioritized benefits above all else. Yema felt that he did not have any grudges against his own country. In addition, his injuries were not light, so he decided to join the War Lions tribe. He had found a temporary foothold in the northern wilderness, and because of his injuries, when Yema joined the War Lions tribe, his strength was of course not at his peak. He was probably at the early stage of the earth level. As the saying goes, when you go out, you have to hold back a trick or two. Naturally, Yema would not go around announcing his true strength. Over time, everyone only thought that he was at the early stage of the earth level. Because of this, some northern wilderness masters like the middle-aged barbarian who were very unhappy with the Bran would repeatedly provoke him. After all, Yema was from the Bran. In addition, he disdained to make a move on these clowns. So, he usually ignored these kinds of actions. Of course, if the middle-aged barbarian dared to come to him in a remote place, he would not mind killing him. As for this pursuit of Tang En, it was completely because he was paid to do it. After all, he had been recuperating in the War Lions tribe until now. Moreover, there were benefits to be reaped after the mission was completed. So, Yema once again became a bounty hunter. Of course, if Yema knew that the culprit who caused the complete annihilation of the bounty hunter group and put him in such a sorry state was right in front of him, the result would be really hard to predict. A void-level warrior. How is that possible? Lan Sha, who was once again being carried away by Tang En, turned around and looked at Yema, who was in the air. His face could not help but turn pale. Whether it was in the Bran or the northern wilderness, void-level warriors were rare existences. What's more, in the open and secret struggles between the tribes, if the War Lions tribe recruited a Bran void-level warrior, there was no reason for Lan Sha not to know. But now, the truth was right in front of her. Moreover, this void-level warrior was so close to her. There was no time to prepare and calculate at all. Therefore, in the face of this kind of overwhelming tyrannical power, even the calm Lan Sha was terrified at this time. He's not void-level. At most, he can only see the threshold. Tang En, who was in a hurry, glanced in Yema's direction and said casually. He was rushing forward in a straight line. Tang En was not just saying this. When Yema first glimpsed the void level, He was watching from the side. Now it seemed that after this period of time, Yema still had not entered the void level. He did not even have half a step like Swafan. Of course, this was not to say that Yema's talent was not good. To be able to cultivate to this level, his talent was basically unquestionable. It was just that the threshold of the void level was too difficult to cross. There were many earth-level masters in the world, but in the end, how many could become a void-level warrior? Of course, it could not be ruled out that Yema spent most of his time recuperating and did not have time to think about breaking through. The reason why Tang En could see that Yema had not broken through to the void level was because of the previous situation. It was easy to imagine that if Yema was already a void-level warrior, or even if he only had 1 foot in, before, he did not even need to move 1,000 meters in this direction. Then he flew in the air, and flew over the heads of the tribal soldiers. The next scene undoubtedly confirmed Tang En's guess. When Yema arrived at the position where Tang En and the others were standing before, he slowly landed. He frowned and looked over here, then directly ran over. Lan Sha saw this and her eyes lit up. Obviously, she also saw this point. She hurriedly asked, "Arthur, how much is the difference in strength between you and him?" Grinning, Tang En could not help but shake his head and smile bitterly. "Haha, sister, you think too highly of me. Even if it's just a threshold, he's still a void level. Let's put it this way. Compared to him, other than speed, I'm trash." Lan Sha heard this and was speechless. She was indeed naive. Yema was a void-level warrior after all. Naturally, Tang En could not compete with him now. Of course, Tang En's speed was also the truth. In terms of straight-line speed, without any assistance, there were not many people in the world who could catch up to him. At least, Tang En had not seen anyone who could. It was also because of this advantage that they were not directly killed when they came into contact with Yema Pu. But this good situation would not last long. Tang En could only move forward in a straight line. This way, he could offset Yema's flying advantage. As for going up the mountain to hide, or going down the mountain to ask for help, it was impossible. After all, no matter how fast his legs were, it was impossible to be faster than flying. In fact, even if he was running on the ground, Yema was still worthy of his strength. Although he was not as abnormal as Tang En, but in a moment, he still caught up with the caravan expert. Fortunately, Yema's target was clear. Or more likely, it was because he did not care, so he did not attack the caravan expert. Otherwise, they would be dead in an instant. The area of this cliff was indeed vast, but it could not withstand Tang En's straight-line speed. After running for less than 10 minutes, Tang En looked at the slope in front of him. He had no choice but to take a detour. And Yema, who was a little depressed from chasing behind, could not help but chuckle. His body suddenly rose into the air again and flew in a straight line. Seeing that the distance between the two sides was getting shorter and shorter, Lan Sha's expression had already recovered. But that was just the habit of a superior. Even if he was about to die, he had to maintain the calmness that matched his status. Facing the strong wind, Lan Sha narrowed his eyes and calmly reminded Yema Pu, "We will reach the cliff in the north in 5 minutes." "I know." A dull reply. Tang En's long and narrow eyes narrowed slightly. He licked his dry lips and said, "Do you have any suggestions?" "Yes. Compared to being captured alive, I'd rather jump off the cliff. TSK. If that's the case, why don't you tell me the location of the antidote? After all, 1 person dying is better than 2 people dying. And I can promise to avenge you in the future. I really appreciate your humor at this moment. Ha ha. Chapter 630. Ha ha. Hearing the laughter that came with the wind, Yema frowned and said expressionlessly, "I'd like to see where you can run to." It had to be said that Tang En's absolute speed had shocked Yema quite a bit. Even though he was stronger, he was undoubtedly the loser in this contest of pure speed. Of course, Yema had already seen the cliff in front of him. Once he reached there, his opponent would naturally have nowhere to run. 5.5 minutes later, Tang En's lightning-fast figure came to an emergency stop. He looked at the swirling cold wind in front of him and shook his head slightly. In fact, based on the distance between them, he could still escape for a while, but it was undoubtedly meaningless. Lan Sha shook her shoulders and took the initiative to break free from Tang En's hand. She took a deep breath and said calmly, "It's a good place. Thank you. Thank you for letting me choose how to die. There's no hurry. It won't be too late for you to jump off the cliff after I die." Tang En turned around and looked at Yema in the distance with narrowed eyes. Waves of bloody light suddenly rose around his body and shrunk. Lan Sha was surprised at first, but then she nodded silently and quickly walked to the side. Of course, she did not think that Tang En could defeat Yema, but she understood Tang En's current mentality. To a certain extent, they were the same kind of people. Even if there was no chance of survival, as long as they were alive and could breathe, they would resolutely choose to fight to the end. The gloomy light and swirling cold wind howled on the cliff like a demon's howl. About 30 seconds later, Yema, who was dressed in a black robe, flew to the top of the cliff. He stopped and stood in the air. His expression was cold and arrogant, and his silver hair danced wildly. He looked just like a king who looked down on the world. He lowered his head and looked at Lan Sha not far away. Then, he shifted his gaze to Tang En, who was diagonally below him. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly into an emotionless smile. Whoosh! He only glanced at him and did not attack. However, the bloody light around Tang En suddenly shone brightly. A bloody and tragic aura instantly filled the air. Tang En's fighting spirit was awe-inspiring. Actually, as an assassin, it was inappropriate for him to accumulate strength in such a high-profile manner. However, Tang En knew that if he didn't circulate the blood and qi in his body and adjust his body to its peak condition in the shortest time possible, he wouldn't have any chance to attack. Heh! A mocking chuckle was heard. Then, a black shadow flashed, and Yema's figure instantly disappeared in the air. When he reappeared, he was already above Lan Sha. Then, his right hand grabbed downward. That's right, Yema's first target was Lan Sha, who was also the target of his mission. As for Tang En, to be honest, he was just like the few experts from the caravan just now. He did not have the qualifications to be taken seriously. When it came to long-distance running, it was already proven that Yema's speed was not as fast as Tang En's. However, in terms of instantaneous burst of power, experts of the same level were actually not much different. However, Tang En was such a freak. His instantaneous explosive power was even more astonishing than his long-distance speed. Yema's bloody fist went against the momentum. Bang! The bloody light and silver light intersected. A ring-shaped ripple instantly exploded in the narrow space. Tang En's ramrod's straight body seemed to be pressed down by a mountain. He suddenly became shorter. In fact, it was because his legs had sunk 1 foot into the ground. As for Yema, his right hand that was grabbing downwards had already been pushed away. His body swayed, and he floated up more than 3 meters. There was no doubt that Yema had been careless. He originally only wanted to capture Lan Sha. However, when he saw Tang En suddenly inserted himself between the two of them, he quickly increased his strength. In this case, one of them was intentional, while the other was unintentional. Naturally, Tang En had a small advantage. As the saying went, there was no expert in a fight, and as the saying went, a bastard would not take advantage of an advantage. Upon seeing this, Tang En's expression became stern. He stomped his right foot. Bang! Crushed stones flew everywhere. His body instantly pulled up from the ground. With a whistling bloody light, he directly pounced on Yema in the air. As there was no way to borrow strength from the void, Yema had just stabilized his body when Tang En instantly approached him. In an instant, bloody lines crisscrossed and densely packed spots of blood covered the front of his body. However, he was naturally not afraid. He was even a little angry. It was the kind of anger that came from being challenged by an insignificant ant. With a wave of his hand, he pulled out an explosive silver light with one hand and pressed it down on Yama's head. Bang, bang, bang. In just an instant, under the dazzling light, Tang En and Yama's figures disappeared in midair. Only the dense sounds of collision that sounded like raindrops hitting banana leaves could be heard. Waves of ripples could also be seen in the void. Of course, Tang En did not have the ability to stand in midair. However, his ghost-like body movement was enough to allow him to borrow any insignificant power to stay in midair for a short period of time. Fortunately, the two were fighting in midair, giving Lan Sha enough time to escape. Otherwise, under the scattered light, she would have no choice but to jump off the cliff. Glancing at the battle in midair, Lan Sha's expression was shocked at this time. She did not expect Tang En's combat power to be so strong. Even in the face of a void stage cultivator, he did not seem to be at a disadvantage. However, just as this thought appeared, Lan Sha's eyes suddenly lit up, and then in her line of sight, balls of silver light were as big as silver plates, floating in the air like the rising sun, dazzling brilliance. The next moment, the rising sun suddenly exploded, instantly radiating a magnificent silver light. Bang, bang, bang in the violent roar, wherever the silver light touched, stones, ancient trees, mountains and so on immediately collapsed, and pits were everywhere. This power was like countless exploding crystals suddenly scattered from the sky. Dust filled the air. It was chaotic. Although Lan Sha retreated 100 meters away, she still staggered and fell to the ground. Fortunately, she did not fall off the cliff. However, she had no time to care about such danger. As soon as she landed, she immediately looked up and narrowed her eyes, looking at the sorry figure in the silver light. The light was dazzling, she could not see clearly, but there was no doubt that it was Tang En. At this time, Tang En's situation was not good. Even Lan Sha, who did not know martial arts, could see that he was sent flying. In the air, his body could not borrow strength, and at this time, a large area of dense silver light poured down at this moment. Cough cough. Empty kill. In the series of explosions, Lan Sha seemed to hear such a clear voice, and then in front of her eyes, she saw Tang En's figure in midair sway slightly, and more than 10 vague figures suddenly appeared in the surrounding area, making it difficult to distinguish between real and fake. Huh! A surprised voice sounded, and the silver light radiated. The more than 10 figures of Tang En were hit one after another, and like a light smoke, they immediately disappeared without a trace. Did he dodge it? Clenching the hem of her clothes, Lan Sha stared at the battle in midair, and she could not help but feel nervous. But at this time, the sound of something rolling suddenly came from the left side. Lan Sha suddenly turned her head, and her narrowed eyes could not help but widen slightly. She saw a figure appear there, rolling along the mountain until it reached a protruding mountain rock. Then, it stretched out a palm and slapped the ground, and jumped up to the top of the mountain rock. Ragged clothes, bleeding from the corner of his mouth, and almost falling down from the mountain rock. Wasn't that Tang En? But, when did he come over? How did he dodge that terrifying silver light? In fact, Lan Sha's question was easy to explain. Tang En only had a flash of inspiration at the critical moment, and changed the aerial kill skill that was originally used to attack to escape. One must know that Tang En's aerial kill skill was not low. Once it was activated, it could transform into more than 10 figures, and when attacking, it could directly appear in front of the target as if ignoring space. So, what was more suitable than the aerial kill skill to escape in the air? Huff, huff, F***ck. What an unlucky year. Gasping for breath, Tang En wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth, and straightened his body again, and stared at the sky. After this short exchange, Tang En truly felt the gap between his strength and Yema's. Although the other party only saw the threshold of Void stage, it sounded similar to the peak of Earth stage. But the real situation was that the difference of a hair's breadth was 1,000 miles. Tang En could compete with Sylvia, who was at the peak of Earth stage, and they were only a hair's breadth apart. But in front of Yema, he did not have the slightest chance. This was the difference between their realms, and it was like a natural chasm. His ghostly body movement, incredible assassination skills, powerful close combat skills, and so on could not unleash the power that he should have in front of Yema's absolute strength. This was a real hopeless situation. It was not very cold at the top, and the howling cold wind blew past, and soon, the smoke and dust that filled the air above the battlefield were cleared. Gradually, Yema's figure appeared in the sight of the two people below. He was still wearing a black robe, and he was hovering in the air, but he was much higher than before. From the outside, he did not seem to be injured, and he did not look as pathetic as Tang En. The only obvious difference from before was that his left sleeve, which was originally empty, was now torn from his shoulder. As the saying goes, hit where it hurts. Since Yema's left arm was broken, Tang En would definitely not let go of this slightly weaker side when he attacked. Because of this, Yema's left sleeve was torn into pieces by the dagger. Yema glanced at the torn part of his black robe on his left shoulder, then narrowed his eyes at Tang En, who was on the mountain rock. His expression was cold. Interesting. Tang En did not reply. Instead, he stretched out his left hand and pointed at the ground. Then, he lifted his chin slightly, opened his palm, and waved at Yema. His meaning was obvious. Come down and fight me if you dare. It was a little arrogant, but also a little provocative. Yema's expression darkened when he saw this. His eyes were as cold as a vulture's, and they kept emitting waves of cold air. Most of the time, actions were more powerful than words. Yes, of course, this was a provocation. If it were in the past, Yema would not have cared. This was not a matter of whether he had the guts or not. Since he could fly in the air, why should he listen to Yema and land on the ground? Why should he give up his advantage to have a so-called fair fight with Yema? This was not a matter of courage, but of intelligence. But now, Tang En fought fiercely with him in the air. Not only did he not die, but he also gained some advantage. Although the advantage was very small, it was an absolute humiliation when compared to the disparity in strength between the two of them. Therefore, the meaning of Tang En's provocation was different as the situation changed. In short, Tang En had used facts to prove that he was qualified to challenge Yema. So, did Yema dare to accept the challenge? Chapter 631. Thud thud thud. Just as the scene fell into a short silence due to Tang En's provocation, the experts from the caravan who had been lagging behind finally arrived at the south side of the craggy rock. Their footsteps paused as they stared blankly at Tang En. Don't come over, retreat. Lan Sha waved his hand and ordered coldly. She knew very well that although Tang En had escaped from Yema's hands before, it did not mean that her loyal guards could do the same. In fact, if they came over, not only would they lose their lives in vain, they might even disrupt Tang En's current strategy. Hee. Yema glanced at Lan Sha, then looked at Tang En again. He narrowed his eyes and suddenly chuckled a few times with a hint of mockery. It was as if he was laughing at an ant who dared to challenge a lion. Then, he waved his right arm, and a whistling silver light pierced through the air and went straight for Tang En's head. This kind of long-range attack naturally could not hurt Tang En. With just a flash, Tang En floated down the rocks and moved more than 10 steps away. Boom! Under this silver light, the rocks seemed to be made of flour and were directly blasted into powder. At this time, Yema's black robe fluttered, and his figure slowly descended with a great deterrent force. When he was about 50 meters away from Tang En, his feet finally touched the ground. The corner of his mouth twitched. Congratulations! Congratulations on getting what you wanted, and congratulations on successfully angering me. Then, his voice was cold, and his figure suddenly burst forward. His right palm was shining with silver thunder. You can die now. Ha ha ha! With a happy laugh, Tang En evaded the tyrannical silver light like a ghost, and an imperceptible blood line slanted towards Yama's throat. His tone was also mocking. Who do you think you are? The bloody dagger was slapped away halfway, but in the next moment, it flashed to Yama's left side and stabbed directly at his heart. In fact, you're not even a void-level warrior. You just know how to fly. Yama frowned slightly. It was not because he was affected by the mocking words, but because he realized that the other party's body seemed to be even more slippery on the ground. In addition, after losing his left arm, the left side of his body became an unavoidable weakness, and his attacks were always a beat slower because of it. In this way, even if each of his attacks had the ability to kill his opponent, it would be useless if he couldn't hit him. Hee, I can understand. Is it because of your condescending gaze that you have developed the laughable mentality of viewing all living beings as ants? Ha! Tang En flashed to the left side of Yama's body again, amidst the afterimages. The dagger's target was still Yama's heart. Stop dreaming. You're not a god. Silver light flashed and directly shook the dagger away. However, the palm that followed still did not hit the target. Anger started to accumulate between Yi Mo's brows. He suddenly realized that the man's voice was a little annoying. It was like a fly that kept buzzing around him. At best, you're just a birdman. The afterimages suddenly stopped 1 foot away from Yama. Taking advantage of this gap, Tang En slightly curled the corner of his mouth, revealing an undisguised sarcastic smile. Then, he evaded Yama's next attack like a ghost. Oh, sorry, I forgot that you've already lost an arm. Then, birdman with broken wings? In the mocking laughter, Yama's chest slightly moved up and down, and his eyes became even colder. The experts of the caravan not far away saw this and opened their mouth. They were completely stunned. Of course, they knew that this madman brand's strength was not bad, and his body movement was even better, but they never thought that he could actually fight Yama head-on and still not be at a disadvantage. And, provoking a void-level warrior like this? Looking at each other, these people's faces were incomparably ridiculous. When did the world become so crazy? Of course, people like Lan Sha secretly thought about the reason why Tang En wanted to die like this. Angering the opponent? That was for sure. But with such strength, other than causing more violent revenge, what else could it do? If Tang En knew what Lan Sha was thinking right now, he would probably curse her out of exasperation. Because at this moment, the violent revenge that Lan Sha was thinking about came, roar. With a roar, the field lit up again, and the disc-like silver Do Chi appeared again, instantly radiating to the whole field. Yama was infuriated. Of course, no one would be able to stand being surrounded by flies that were spitting out venomous tongues. When Yama landed on the ground, he originally planned to kill the opponent to prove that whether it was in the sky or on the ground, he could kill the opponent without any suspense. But after fighting for a while, Yama was shocked to find that his attack speed could not catch up with the opponent, so naturally, he could not kill the opponent. In addition, Tang En's shameless ridicule just now made Yama change his attack method. He planned to directly use his power to suppress the opponent. Yama's full power was terrifying, and the silver Do Chi spread out like mercury. Tang En had already realized that things were not going well. He was shocked and wanted to retreat, but no matter how fast he was, he could not be faster than the silver Do Chi. About 30 meters away from Yama, Tang En was caught up by the spreading silver Do Chi, and his ghostly figure could not help but stop. And this was the opportunity that Yama wanted to attack. His figure instantly shot forward, and his face was ferocious as he slammed his palm down. The silver Do Chi was only used to restrict, and it did not have the special effect of stopping everything in its range, at least for people like Tang En. Therefore, Tang En could barely dodge the first attack. But Yema had already used his power to suppress the opponent, so naturally, he would not let Tang En go so easily. Then, the second palm slammed down on the head. Seeing this, Tang En knew that he could not avoid this attack no matter what, so he decisively threw away the dagger, and with a roar, the blood Do Chi burst out like a tide. He put his palms together and blocked the attack. Boom, the blood Do Chi shattered, and a spatial ripple visible to the naked eye instantly spread out. Not far away, the few loyal experts of the caravan did not listen to Lan Shah's advice and retreat in time, so they could not escape from the silver Do Chi. Now that they were hit by the ripple, their chests felt like they were hit by a galloping horse. Their throats were sweet, and they spat out a large amount of blood mist. If the experts of the caravan were like this, Tang En, as the person involved, was even more so. As soon as the collision began, his brain felt as if there were thousands of golden gongs ringing at the same time, full of buzzing sounds. Then, the mountain-like pressure on his arms instantly pressed down, and the bones all over his body groaned together, the pain penetrating into the bone marrow. For a moment, Tang En felt as if his body had been crushed into powder by this palm, just like the rock that had suddenly appeared out of nowhere earlier. Ah! Roaring through his teeth, Tang En raised his arms high to protect the vital parts of his head. His defense was not smashed open, but his feet were lighter, and his waist had completely sunk into the stone ground of the mountain. This was the furious attack of a void-grade master. It was really terrifying. And this was just the beginning. Lifting his palm lightly, Yemo looked at Tang En, who was still intact, and raised his eyebrows slightly, seemingly a little surprised. But then he took a slight breath, and the silver Do Chi wrapped around his palm like flowing water, as if it had doubled in size out of thin air, and slammed down again expressionlessly. Roar. With a loud roar, Tang En crossed his fists, and his left and right hands instantly changed positions. First, he slightly retracted his hand, and then the blood Do Chi on his arms erupted again, directly blocking the attack. Boom, chi chi chi. In the muffled sound of the collision, with the area where the two fought as the center, the surrounding stone ground instantly cracked, and then like a spider web, it continued to spread to the periphery. Finally, with a loud crash, half of Tang En's body sank instantly, completely disappearing into the ground, falling into a large pit. Hiss! The masters of the caravan who had just been hit by the spear were unlucky, but after being sent flying 7 or 8 meters away, they were lucky enough to avoid the more ferocious second impact. So when they had time to watch the battle, they couldn't help but gasp, and a chill ran down their spines. Previously, although they were also in awe of Yemo, after seeing him repeatedly fail to hit Tang En, they couldn't help but think that this was all there was to it. But now that they saw Yemo's palm really hit the ground, as if he was hammering iron directly into Madman Bran, they truly felt the horror of a void-grade master. Even so, they couldn't help but secretly admire Tang En, who had dodged several attacks before. This kind of battle was simply inhuman, right? Was that Madman Bran still alive? Chapter 632. Cold wind blew past. The hole was deep, with large and small stones piled up inside. Occasionally, rotten plant roots could be seen among them. It looked like a ruin. Yema's black robe fluttered as he hovered above the ruins of the hole. He lowered his head and narrowed his eyes as if he was trying to determine whether the person was dead or not. Then, he curled his lips slightly and stretched out his right hand toward the hole. He opened his 5 fingers. Whoosh! The silver fighting spirit gathered and formed a round plate again. It was a simple principle. Regardless of whether the person was dead or not, he would know after the explosion. Whoosh! The silver plate flew out, leaving a silver trail behind it as it fell straight into the hole below. There was no doubt that this attack could definitely plow through everything in the hole again. At this moment, suddenly, bang! Gravel flew everywhere. A figure shot out of the hole before the silver plate landed. As soon as he touched the ground, he quickly flew to the side and rolled on the ground. In the next moment, boom! The hole behind him that had been destroyed repeatedly exploded again. Waves of air rose and stone powder flew everywhere, stirring up the area. Puff! The figure's reaction was fast, and his dodging movements were not standard. However, when he was hit by the waves of air, he could not help but spit out a large amount of blood. However, he did not stop retreating at all. With the help of the waves of air, his speed increased and he instantly rushed out of the range of the silver plate's explosion. Lan Sha, who had already hidden a few 100 meters away, narrowed her eyes because the figure was retreating in the northwest direction. She could not help but bite her lips and murmur after recognizing the figure. Naturally, the person who escaped from the hole without delay could only be Tang En. However, Tang En's appearance was really embarrassing now. His hair was disheveled, and his face was covered in dust. What was more terrifying was that his facial features were bleeding, and there were stains on his face. It was a ghastly sight. Tang En's blood-red eyes swept around. His chest was heaving up and down like a broken bellows. When he saw Lan Sha, his eyes flashed, and he quietly reached out his hand to point at the cliff. This movement was very subtle and disappeared in a flash. However, Lan Sha undoubtedly saw it. She blinked and looked a little puzzled. However, after thinking for 3 seconds, she got up from hiding behind the mountain rock and walked to the cliff. At this moment, things are getting more and more interesting. With a soft chuckle, Yemo, who was a few feet above the ground, passed through the smoke and dust. He watched in amazement as Tang En slowly descended. I have to say, you've given me a great surprise. That includes your previous speed and your current powerful body. This wasn't a joke, but a true statement from the bottom of his heart. Being able to cultivate to his current level, Yemo's experience was abundant. But even so, he had never seen a cultivator as strange as Tang En. His speed was as swift as the wind, his terrifying instantaneous explosive power, and his seemingly indestructible body, all of these brought quite a bit of shock to Yemo, and even a little bit of fear. Putting everything else aside, at least Yemo was sure that when he was at the same level as the other party, he definitely didn't have such powerful combat strength. Tang En did not respond to the compliment. He raised his hand to wipe away the blood under his nose and turned around. His face was covered in dust, and his white teeth were covered in blood. He revealed a brilliant smile. Then, he raised his hand toward Yemo, bent his fingers, and waved his hand again. It's useless to talk, let's fight. It was still a provocation, and it was still that annoying look. Seeing this, Yemo's gaze turned cold, and he frowned in disgust. Originally, since we're both from the Bran, before he could finish speaking, Tang En shouted coldly, "Noisy!" Then, he instantly turned around and ran toward the sparse forest beside the cliff. Yemo was stunned for a moment, and monstrous anger instantly surged out of his heart. His face was ashen. He was an expert, after all. In a situation where he could completely control the situation of the battle, he would either directly kill his opponent and end the matter, or he would like to say some indifferent words, perhaps to humiliate his opponent, or perhaps to enjoy the pleasure of killing. To be honest, this was beyond reproach. The weak were prey to the strong in the world. If you didn't want to be humiliated, or wanted to humiliate others to enjoy the pleasure, then you just had to ensure that your strength was higher than others. If your strength was lower, then you could only pinch your nose and accept your fate. Don't blame the heavens or others. Of course, even if you did, you would still have to die. But that was not the case for Tang En. His strength was lower than Yemo's, but he looked even more arrogant than Yemo. It had to be said that this was the legendary act of courting death. At that moment, the silver light that Yema had released had yet to fade away. Because of it, Tang En would not be able to get far. Trying to run, Yema growled, and the mercury-like silver light spread out again, causing ripples to appear. And every time the ripples spread out, Tang En had to stop for a moment. After just 2 ripples, Yema, with a cold expression, charged toward him again. Without another word, he swung his huge silver palm at him. This time, Tang En did not choose to block the attack horizontally. Instead, he took a step back and pushed forward with his bloody hands. Bang! When he received the attack, his body looked as if it had been hit by a 10,000-pound hammer, and he was sent flying while blood filled the air. Humph! I came down as you wished. Yema snorted coldly. Before Tang En could land on the ground, Yema instantly appeared before him and swung his palm again, expressionlessly. But you've disappointed me greatly. Tang En roared. He managed to stabilize himself in the air and faced Yema's huge silver palm with one hand. Bang! Crack! The clear sound of bones breaking could be heard amidst the impact. His right arm immediately went limp, and his body crashed heavily on the ground. Bang! The moment Tang En landed on the ground, he flipped away. But before he could get up completely, Yema appeared before him again. Bang! 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 On the ground, in the air. Palm strikes, elbow strikes, knee strikes. Tang En was covered in a bloody glow, but there was even more blood on his body. He looked like a real sandbag. He kept retreating under all kinds of attack. He did not know how much blood he spat out, and he did not know how many bones in his body were broken. All he could do was to raise his arm to block every attack, regardless of whether it was useful or not. As for the rest, he just let Yema do whatever he wanted. Suppress, suppress, and continue to suppress. This was the suppression of absolute strength. There was no logic to it. In front of Yema, who was willing to risk everything, Tang En's speed, skills, assassination techniques, and so on were all fake. The elites from the merchant group were completely stunned. They did not even see Elder Lei and the others running toward them. Of course, when the latter got close, he also stopped in his tracks and looked at the situation in a daze. There was no need to talk about Yema's strength. He could sweep through the entire place without any pressure. But who was the person being beaten up? That was right. He did not have any strength to fight back, but he could still maintain his consciousness after taking so many heavy blows from Yema. He even stretched out his arm to block the attacks accurately. This was insane. Of course, even though they were shocked, no one thought that Tang En could continue to hold on. What kind of joke was this? With such heavy blows, even someone as hard as cold iron would break, except for Lan Sha. Actually, Lan Sha was not sure himself. After all, Tang En did not look like he was far from death, and there were no signs of him turning the tables. However, Lan Sha stood at the edge of the cliff. When he thought about Tang En's subtle warning just now, he still had some hope in his heart, but just a little bit. The game ends here. At this moment, Yema suddenly said coldly. He then took a deep breath and placed one of his palms in front of his chest. Thousands of threads of silver light instantly gathered until they formed a silver ball of light that looked like a small sun. It shone brightly. As he watched Tang En fall freely from the sky, his gaze turned fierce. Die! His body suddenly charged forward, and his wide black robe flapped vertically behind him with a beep. It even let out a sharp sound as it pierced through the air. The next moment, Yema arrived at the spot where Tang En had landed. He looked at the weak posture formed by the trembling arms in front of him mockingly and pushed out the silver ball. Boom! It was a direct hit. Crack, 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 crack. In an instant, Tang En's bloody arms were shaken off. His chest caved in at a speed visible to the naked eye under the heavy pressure of the ball of light. Puff! He raised his head and spat out a large amount of blood. Tang En's body leaned back straight, and his chest was almost as thin as a sheet of paper. He quickly flew into the sparse forest behind him until there was a loud bang, mixed with the sound of a tree trunk breaking and collapsing. There was no sound. There was no doubt that just based on the tragic situation just now, Tang En would definitely die regardless of whether he hit the tree or not. It's finally over. The masters of the trade caravan sighed in relief when they saw this. Of course, they were not cheering for Yema. They just felt that it would be better for Tang En to die quickly and peacefully rather than suffer such a terrible beating. However, no one noticed that Yema was looking down at his own palms and frowning slightly. When he hit Tang En's chest just now, it seemed like he did not hit him completely. It was just a feeling of touch. It was very subtle and happened in a flash, so Yema did not dare to be sure. Moreover, he saw with his own eyes that Tang En's chest caved in. This could not be a lie. Shaking his head slightly, Yema easily dispelled the doubts in his heart. He raised his head and looked past the masters of the trade caravan, stopping on Elder Lei and the others. Elder Lei hesitated for a moment, then placed his right hand on his left shoulder and bowed slightly, performing a northern wilderness salute. This was a direct submission of strength, and also an apology for his previous neglect. Yema's eyes flashed. He also placed his right hand on his left shoulder, nodded slightly, and returned the salute. After all, he would have to stay in the Battle Lions tribe in the future. Although Elder Lei was not as strong as him, his status was not low. It was only right for him to express his gratitude. Then, Yema turned around and looked at Lan Sha, who was at the edge of the cliff. The corners of his mouth curled up and he stepped forward. Now this was his prey. How dare you? Stop! The masters of the trade caravan were shocked when they saw this. Although they knew that they were not as strong as the other party, they still pounced without hesitation. It could be said that they were loyal. However, Yema was no longer in the mood to make a move. His figure flashed, and he instantly broke away from the entanglement and arrived in front of Lan Sha. He stretched out his right hand. Wait! Lan Sha suddenly shouted and took a step back. Half of the soles of his shoes were already in the air. He said calmly, "Do you want a broken corpse or a living me?" Yema chuckled, but he did not immediately capture Lan Sha. Of course, he could do this at any time. There was no need to rush. "Beautiful Highness, the mission I received is that you'd better live. Yes, don't think about jumping off the cliff or other childish thoughts. At this distance I can easily fish you up." Lan Sha's expression did not change when he heard this. He said slowly, "You're from the Bran, so you don't know. In fact, as long as the people of the Heavenly Wolf royal family want to commit suicide, no one can capture them alive." "Is that so? Let's give it a try." Yema seemed to be very interested, but it was more of a joke. It was as if he was teasing a caged animal that was on its last legs. Lan Sha stood there silently. She seemed to be at a loss for words, but at the same time, she seemed to be thinking about her suicide technique. 10 seconds later, Yema frowned. "This is your suicide technique?" The masters of the trade caravan were afraid to attack, but Lan Sha was still silent. Let's not talk about whether or not this suicide technique really existed. Even if it did exist, it might not be effective. In fact, the silent Lan Sha did not even think about it. She was currently chanting in her heart, come out, Arthur, come out quickly." That's right, Lan Sha still did not believe that Arthur was dead. She believed it rationally, but she did not believe it emotionally. Don't misunderstand, this feeling was not that. The reason why she did not believe it was because ever since they escaped, Tang En kept surprising her. Lan Sha was willing to believe that Tang En could surprise her again this time. So, from just now, she had been delaying Yema. "You're wasting your time, Your Highness." Yema lost his patience. He reached out and touched the bridge of his nose. Then, he took a step forward and reached out to grab Lan Sha's shoulder. "You're waiting for something, right? Let me guess. Reinforcements?" It can't be that person who died just now, right? Before he finished speaking, just as Yema's arm was halfway through, and the masters of the trade caravan looked on angrily but did not dare to make a move, suddenly. Yema, Eunice, Sang Pu, Oliver. The words were hurried and almost connected into a line. It was like a vague spell mumbled by a magician, making people feel confused. But Yema instantly understood. His arm suddenly stopped and he was startled. It was not strange that his name was known. After all, he did not have an alias when he joined the War Lion tribe. But it did not make sense that the names of his teammates who had been through bloody battles with him, Eunice, Sang Pu, and Oliver, who were now dead, were mentioned by others. The change was too sudden, but Lan Shah's eyes suddenly lit up, and a great sense of ecstasy and excitement surged in his heart. Her position was facing the crowd, so she naturally saw a figure in the film and television space, as if there was nothing there. He flashed from the side of the forest to the front. The distance between them was not far to begin with. Coupled with the fact that he was in a daze, when Yemo recovered from the gust of wind, his vision blurred, and a person who should not have appeared suddenly appeared in his line of sight. His hair was disheveled, his face was distorted, and his face was covered in blood. He looked like an abyssal demon that had just climbed up from the ground. How could it be? Doubt, shock, and even a little fear, all kinds of emotions were mixed in his mind. Then, Yema felt his waist and right arm being held tightly. Then, bang, a strong impact pounced on him. He could not help but fly into the air and fall directly into the abyss behind him. Be careful, the warning came late. It came from Elder Lei and the others who were not far away. Because of the angle, they were also the first to discover Tang En's figure, but Tang En's speed was far beyond their imagination. When the warning came, they had already seen the resolute figure holding Yema's body and rushing directly into the abyss. A strong wind swept past, and the two figures in front of them suddenly disappeared at the same time. Even Lan Shah, who had been mentally prepared, was slightly startled. After he reacted, he hurriedly turned to look at the abyss. In just a short moment, the two people who were holding each other had turned into inconspicuous little black dots that sank into the smoke below and disappeared in an instant. He shouted sharply, "Arthur, this was also Tang En's plan. A plan to survive in the face of death." From the beginning, Tang En knew that he had no chance. He definitely could not block Yema's attack. If possible, abandoning Lan Shah and escaping alone was undoubtedly a wise choice. After all, Yema's target was Lan Shah. As long as what he had done before was not exposed, Yema would definitely not pay attention to him. However, Tang En was poisoned and could not leave. If he left Lan Shah, he would definitely die. Thus, there was only one choice, and that was to kill Yema. To be honest, from the difference in strength between the two sides, this was undoubtedly a fantasy. However, since there was no other choice, Tang En would not give up halfway. First of all, if he wanted to kill Yema, he had to make him return to the surface. And if he wanted to make him return to the surface, he had to find a way to anger him. Anger would reduce a person's rationality when making judgments. Thus, Tang En took the lead and attacked with all his might, shattering Yema's left sleeve. Without a doubt, a normal person would be deeply affected if they lost an arm, let alone a Void Realm martial artist like Yema. Thus, as long as he shattered Yema's left sleeve and completely exposed his disability, it would be impossible for Yema not to be angry. Then, Tang En naturally made a provocative gesture, and finally made Yema return to the surface. Of course, Yema was still a Void Realm martial artist when he returned to the surface. His crushing strength was still there, and Tang En was still not his opponent. However, at this time, at least it gave Tang En a chance to greatly weaken Yema's strength. And the source of this chance could only be from the cliff. The reason was very simple. No matter who it was, as long as they fell from such a height, they would definitely die. That's right, Yema could fly for a short period of time, but he was not a real Void Realm martial artist. Thus, as long as he entangled him and kept disturbing him, Tang En really did not believe that Yema could fly anywhere in this situation. Of course, to achieve this result, there were two prerequisites. First, Yema had to obediently stand at the edge of the cliff. Second, Tang En had to stick close to him. The first precondition was easy to achieve. As long as Lan Sha stood at the edge of the cliff, Yema would have to go there himself if he wanted to capture her. The difficult part was the second precondition, sticking close to him and not getting close. Tang En could achieve close combat in a mobile battle, but in fact, there was still a safe distance in between. Except for face-to-face dancing, normally, no one would like to have someone standing close to them, especially a big man. So, there was no need to talk about martial artists. It must be known that martial artists were naturally sensitive to things that exceeded this safe distance, because it meant that they could not react to danger in time, such as assassination. However, martial artists were also human. Under some special circumstances they would not react when someone got close to them, or it could be said that they did not have time to react. In the current situation, it could only be because they were too shocked and stunned. Then, when they saw the person they killed suddenly appear in front of them, would they be shocked? When they were in a foreign land, and their past was suddenly exposed, would they be stunned? There was no doubt about the answer, and Yema had hit the nail on the head. He thought that the light ball could kill Tang En in one hit. However, in fact, although the light ball was powerful enough, his illusion of missing was not wrong. That was because Tang En had used the bone shrinkage skill without delay, and a large area of his chest was instantly dented. Needless to say, such a large compression of the chest was naturally a heavy burden on Tang En's body. Therefore, in the situation where the light ball had not completely hit him, Tang En raised his head and spat out a large mouthful of blood. It was a miracle that he did not pass out directly. Well, at least the effect was more like it, blinding Yema's eyes. One step after another, one step after another, one step after another. He trembled with fear, as if he was treading on thin ice. It was not an exaggeration to say that there was a slight mistake in any of the steps. There was no need for any mistake, because Yema's existence was a real bug. One mistake, and Tang En was now lying on the field, his body cold. Fortunately, Tang En succeeded. Whether it was strength or luck, Tang En finally succeeded in throwing Yema into the abyss of the cliff. Of course, this was definitely not the end. Tang En was never interested in dying together with others, even if the other party was a void-level martial artist or higher. This was not an honor that he was proud of, because everyone only had one life. Everything was ready, and the last step was naturally to kill Yema. However, Tang En was not confident in this step. It seemed that there was no other way except to ask the gods to protect him. Chapter 633. Sorry, something happened at the raccoon's house, and let's not talk about the rest. I'll make up the missing words tomorrow. Arthur, seeing Tang En and Yema's figures disappear into the smoke, Lan Sha subconsciously narrowed her eyes. She was in a daze. She could guess that Tang En might not be dead, and that he might have some backup plans. However, she definitely did not expect that Tang En would choose to die together with her the moment he rushed out. No wonder he let her stand here before. Was she touched? A little. Although logically speaking, the other party was also thinking for him. However, he was indeed risking his life to save her. What's more, he was not from the northern wilderness. He had no obligation or loyalty to protect her at this moment. Quick, capture His Highness. Elder Lei, who was not far away, was the first to recover from the shock. He waved his hand decisively and ordered, quick, capture His Highness. Yema was just a guest elder. He was not a real Battle Lion tribe member. Moreover, Elder Lei did not think that a Void Realm warrior would die so easily. After all, he could fly. Therefore, compared to worrying about Yema, Elder Lay was more concerned about whether or not he could capture Lan Sha. The silent scene was instantly broken. The expressions of the experts from the trade caravan changed drastically. They quickly turned around and shouted, "Captain, let's go! You want to leave?" Lan Sha turned around and looked at Elder Lay and the others, who clearly had the upper hand. Then, she looked at the reinforcements in the distance, who were still nowhere to be seen. She could not help but shake her head and smile bitterly. The running speed of experts was not something that soldiers could compare to. Tang En and Yema had not fought for long. Although the experts from the trade caravan and Elder Lay's group had rushed over, it was impossible for them to wait for the tens of thousands of elite soldiers to arrive. As for now, there were only 5 experts in the trade caravan, while Elder Lay and the others had 8 or 9. The individual strength of the two sides was not far apart. This way, it was obvious that they would not be able to stop them. In fact, the current situation was more or less the same. Lan Sha only muttered to himself for a moment, and one of the weaker experts of the caravan, who could only take on 2 opponents at once, was sent flying back while vomiting blood, rolling in front of Lan Sha. Narrowing his eyes, Lan Sha, who seemed to have made some sort of decision, stepped forward and helped him up. He waved his hand to stop him from speaking and hurriedly said, "Listen to me. Go down the mountain immediately and tell Orson and the others to annihilate the 10,000 rebels and these experts. Remember, this is my last order. If they don't want to be held accountable by my mother, well, that's all they have to say. Do you understand?" The experts of the caravan nodded subconsciously. "Very well, go on." Lan Sha patted the expert's shoulder and smiled. He took a few steps back and opened his arms. Final order. Before the experts of the caravan could react, they saw Lan Sha's figure vanish from the cliff. His eyes suddenly widened as if they were about to pop out of their socket. "Your Highness!" With a sorrowful cry, he rushed to the edge of the cliff. Lan Sha had already quickly chased into the smoke. He seemed to have seen the expert of the caravan and finally waved his hand as if he was saying goodbye or asking him to quickly go down the mountain to pass on his orders. Both sides of the battle paused when they heard the sound. They turned around and couldn't help but cry out, "Your Highness!" The royal family of the northern wilderness had existed since ancient times, and the royal prestige was naturally deeply ingrained in the hearts of all the people of the northern wilderness. Therefore, even the traitorous Elder Lay and the others couldn't help but turn pale with fright when they saw this scene. That's right. Under such circumstances, Lan Sha really had no way out. However, Elder Lay and the others didn't expect Lan Sha to be so resolute then. A deafening roar shook the sky. Roar. "Kill them and avenge His Highness. Kill! Kill!" After a short silence, the battle at the edge of the cliff became even more tragic. The air above the abyss was shrouded in smoke. Gusts of bone-piercing cold wind were like the cries of ghosts and howls of wolves from the depths of the abyss. However, these sounds fell into the ears of the 2 people who were falling rapidly, and only monotonous whistling was left. Because the way he jumped was wrong, Tang En's mouth was instantly filled with countless gusts of cold wind. It was infinitely magnified, and even the blood between his teeth could be seen clearly. At the same time, his eyes, which couldn't bear the wind, were instantly filled with tears. Together with the blood on his face, he was really in a sorry state. Tang En's reaction wasn't slow. His hands and feet immediately wrapped around Yama's body like a koala bear. He forcibly straightened his body and took a long breath. F***CK. No matter how stunned he was, in this kind of environment, this kind of movement should have woken him up. However, before Yama could finish the first syllable, Tang En's arms suddenly hugged him even tighter. His right hand quietly shone with a bloody glow. His expression was very sinister. "You had quite a lot of fun beating me up just now, my Void Realm warrior. Then, what about now? Let's die together." He instantly raised his right hand, and a bloody dagger suddenly pierced through the back of Yama's head. Bang! That's right, this was the last step of Tangen's plan, to use the blood void blade to kill Yama. After all, Yama was a void realm warrior. Before he fell from the cliff, he was also in the middle of a battle, so there was a faint silver light shield around his body. Don't underestimate this seemingly faint light shield. In fact, its defensive ability was not weaker than battle chi armor. Regarding this point, Tangen had already proven it in the battle just now. Of course, Tangen's blood chi was also not weak. With a series of accumulation of special effects, it was actually better than battle chi. But at this stage, Tangen's blood chi was not enough to break Yama's defense with his bare hands. He had to rely on the innate sharpness of the weapon, and then use his blood chi to infinitely stimulate the sharpness of the weapon's sharpness to have a chance of successfully breaking Yama's defense. So, as a carrier, the stronger the weapon, the better. Tangen's dagger, which was completely made of black meteorite iron, should be enough. But unfortunately, in order to block Yama's attack, Tangen was forced to throw away the dagger. It was not that he did not have time to put it in his sleeve. For Tangen, it was just a thought. But the series of beatings that followed undoubtedly proved that Tangen's move was wise. If the dagger was still there, under heavy pressure, it would be hard to say where the hidden dagger would stab. Therefore, from the very beginning, Tangen had set his sights on the Empyrean blood dagger. Although it was not a physical weapon, it was a dagger that was completely formed from extremely powerful blood aura, so its power was naturally guaranteed. But the problem now was that Tangen had not mastered this skill. At best, he could only vaguely feel it. In the past, he had countless trials, but there had never been a successful case. And this was the reason why he needed the blessings of the gods and Buddhas. If he succeeded, Tangen would successfully kill Yama, then he would see if there was a chance to escape. If he failed, then he would entangle Yama and not give him a chance to escape. In the end, they would both turn into minced meat. It was a complete test of his character. However, it had to be said that from his experience in this strange world until now, Tangen's character was indeed not worthy of praise. And now, it was naturally no exception. Bang! Looking at the blood blade dagger that instantly scattered into specks of blood when it hit the back of Yama's head, Twain's vicious expression instantly turned into melancholy. He smacked his lips and said, why don't we put on another show? Don't worry, I will definitely succeed this time. In midair, whoosh! The silver light suddenly shone brightly, like the rising sun. The entangled, bloated body suddenly stagnated, and the falling speed was greatly reduced. Although Yama didn't know what Tangen was doing, he naturally wouldn't be so stupid as to allow others to make gestures on his body again. The silver light's fighting energy exploded violently, and he was about to directly shake off Tangen. However, Twain was naturally prepared for this. He stuck close to Yama, and his bones continuously emitted explosive sounds. The vital energy and blood in his body surged out madly like floodwaters, ceaselessly counteracting the might of the silver light. If Yama was in his normal state, Tangen naturally wouldn't be able to defeat him. But now, Yama's only right arm was tightly held by Tangen, and he had undoubtedly lost half of his attacking ability. There was no other way, he couldn't just bite. Yama's best attack now was to use his fighting energy to shake off until his right arm was freed. Unfortunately, Tangen's fighting energy was as abnormal as his speed. Although in terms of absolute power, Tangen's fighting energy was still inferior to Yama's silver light, it was still possible for him to not be shaken off in a short period of time. In the current environment, they might have already become minced meat in a short period of time. Puff! He spat out a large mouthful of blood, and it instantly disappeared without a trace. Tangen grinned. Although his bones and internal organs were severely dislocated due to the continuous invasion of the silver light, he still grinned, revealing his white teeth that were covered in blood. Ha ha! Stop struggling, I won't let go even if I die. At the same time, the blood blade gathered and pressed against Yama's back where his heart was. Bang, it shattered again without any surprise. Then go to hell. Huh. Yama Vulture's eyes suddenly became fierce, and the silver light surged wildly like a mountain. Crack! Tang En's two arms, especially his left hand that was holding Yama's right arm, immediately let out a crisp cracking sound. No, if this continues, my fighting energy might be able to hold on, but my body will collapse first. Tang En's two arms tightly held onto Yama's body, and he thought for a few seconds. His long and narrow eyes narrowed slightly. Cough cough. Don't you want to know why I know about Eunice, Sang-Pu, and Oliver? Yama's struggling body paused, and he turned his head slightly, staring coldly at Tang En's eyes. Why? Tang En gathered the blood blade in his right hand again, and the corner of his mouth rose. Ha, guess. The silver light shrunk. All right, since you ask so sincerely, then I'll be merciful and tell you. Before he finished speaking, the silver light suddenly burst out. Yama was not a fool. Someone who could cultivate to such a level was undoubtedly not lacking in intelligence. Tang En's way of talking was obviously to divert his attention. Puff. Okay. So impatient, that's a very long story. Cough cough. Tang En spat out blood, and it did not fall down, but rose instead, and most of it soaked Yama's silver hair. Actually, I killed Eunice with my own hand. Haha, that girl who loved to look pretty, what a pity. As he spoke, the blood blade broke on Yama's back again. Sang-Pu too, I stabbed him in the heart with a dagger and killed him directly. Well, his body should still be here, but it can only float in the desert space, haha. Yama stretched out his trembling right hand, and the blood light gathered again. However, at this time, Yama suddenly narrowed his eyes and interrupted Tang En's long-winded speech. He said coldly, "You are the Grey Coat Army, the person who killed Goshawk?" Just like what was said just now, Yama was definitely not stupid. On the contrary, he was very smart, or else he would not have made the Dusk Hunter group so famous. He had seen Tang En in the Grey Coat Army's encampment before, and he also had an impression of this blood-colored fighting energy and the previously pitted dagger. It was just that the time between then and now was too long, and he could not connect the dots at the moment. Now that he had gathered the enemies of Eunice and Sang-Pu, he naturally recalled these details quickly, and finally confirmed Tang En's identity. "Sure enough, it's you," Yama said word by word between his teeth. He stared at the culprit who caused the complete annihilation of the Dusk Hunter group and caused him to fall into such a miserable state. His expression instantly became extremely distorted, and he almost wanted to bite someone. Haha, that's right, it's me. Seeing that he had been seen through, Tang En simply admitted it. He grinned and laughed, full of evil intentions. As long as I kill you, the famous Dusk Hunter group in the bounty hunting world will be completely destroyed in my hand. Haha, thinking about it, it's really a big sense of accomplishment. Crack. Needless to say, the blood blade broke again. At the same time, Yama suddenly raised his head and roared. His voice shook the cliff, and murderous intent appeared in his eyes. The radiant silver light surged like waves, and it was obvious that he had instantly entered a berserk state after knowing the truth. F***CK. Void Bloodblade, I can't believe your broken skill is all about the word void. Can't you F***King succeed once, puff? A large mouthful of blood mist was spat out again. His body trembled. Tang En tried his best to press down Yama's restless right arm while he madly complained about Void Bloodblade's skill. Yama's berserk state could not be understood with common sense. Tang En spat out a large mouthful of blood mist, and his shoulder suddenly hurt. He could not help but let out a scream. Ah! He suddenly turned his head, and his eyes suddenly froze. He was stunned to see Yama crazily opening his mouth and biting off a piece of flesh from his shoulder. F***ck. Tangan was not an easy person to deal with. Yema's action inspired him, and he immediately turned his head to bite the blood vessel on Yema's neck. In a sense, teeth were indeed a kind of weapon. Even in ancient times, it was an indispensable weapon for humans. But in front of him, a noble master who had touched the threshold of void level. A top assassin who had obtained the glory of 1,000 kills and whose hands were dripping with blood. Tangled together, he actually chose to use his teeth to decide life and death. It had to be said that this was also an unprecedented creation. And these actions were just the beginning. This time, Tangan took the lead. His right hand grabbed Yema's long silver hair and immediately pulled it down. Even if Yema was a void-level warrior, he could not help but raise his head in embarrassment after being hit by this attack. Then, biting, headbutting, pulling hair, and so on. These were supposed to be the ultimate skills of a shrew, but now they reappeared one by one on the two of them, and they were even better. The cold wind whistled, and the abyss was dark. The two of them rolled and trembled like this, and from time to time they let out horrifying screams and fell straight down. Chapter 634. The body was the most primitive weapon. No weapon, no armor, no fighting energy. In the end, the way to determine victory and defeat would be completely primitive. From this point of view, the two people who were falling rapidly and fighting each other had undoubtedly used this primitive method of attack to the extreme. It looked like a fight between a shrew and a group of children, but it drew the line between life and death so that blood could be seen. At this moment, there was no status, no hierarchy. There was nothing left. The only thing left was that the two of them kept thinking about how to kill each other in this limited way of attack. For example, bite him to death? Strangle him to death? Or spit on him to disgust him first? The wind whistled. Because Yema suddenly went berserk, the two of them were falling faster and faster. Although the two of them were not in the mood to care about other things, they vaguely understood that they were about to fall to the bottom of the cliff. Huff, huff, bang. Amidst the breaths that sounded like broken bellows, the blood blade once again shattered mercilessly on Yema's back. At the same time, Tangan's confidence was also shattered. It still didn't work. It still didn't work? It seemed that the saying of fighting to survive in the face of death was mostly just a saying. Or maybe it was because he was not the protagonist in the dark legend who could not be killed, so the protagonist's halo was seriously not enough? It was no wonder that Tang En complained like this. In the modern world, Tang En was also a bookworm on the internet. In those fantasy novels, no matter what kind of predicament the protagonist who transmigrated to the past faced, no matter how strong the enemy was, even if he was beaten badly at first, in the end, his little universe would inexplicably erupt and turn the tables. If *King transmigrated here too, why doesn't it work when it comes to me? Could it be that I was not beaten badly enough just now? It can't be. Or is it because I killed too many people before, so my character has already been ruined? It had to be said that the emergence of such a messy and strange thought showed that Tang En's current state of mind was gradually becoming blurred. It was not because he was depressed or lost his fighting spirit. It was because Tang En's body was seriously overloaded and was on the verge of collapse. That's right, Tang En's body was extremely abnormal. From a certain point of view, after the upgrade of the system and the old butler's internal and external training method, Tang En's external body was much stronger than the Dochi warriors of this world. However, no matter how hard a metal was, it would still be deformed after being forged. Under the violent impact of the Yema battle aura, which had touched the threshold of the void level, Twain's abnormal physique was undoubtedly not enough. If it were not for the fact that his blood chi had been bitterly supporting him, his body would have been torn apart long ago. Forget it, forget it. It's not a bad choice to perish together. Let's get to the bottom of the mountain. Tang En shook his head unconsciously and drooped his eyelid. He was seriously dispirited. Now, he wanted to reach the bottom of the mountain as soon as possible so that both of them would be smashed into meat paste. However, the world was often so mysterious. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, half a minute. The surrounding mountain walls were dark and boundless, and they were still falling rapidly. This made Tang En feel like he was hailing a taxi on the side of the road in the modern world. When he didn't need it, there were empty cars one after another, and the drivers were crying and shouting to give him a ride. When he needed it urgently, there was a lot of traffic on the side of the road, and there was not a single empty car. How sad. With a scream, just as Tang En's brain was getting out of control, he felt a sharp pain in his shoulder near his neck. His whole body trembled, and he immediately woke up. When he turned his head, it turned out that Yema had taken advantage of his momentary trance to bite him again. Yema was seriously injured, and her beautiful silver hair was almost bald. Especially her 2 eyes, which had been hit by someone's forehead repeatedly. They were purple and black, and blood was blurred, causing her vision to be blurred. That was why she missed the opportunity and bit the wrong place. Bah! Since he was going to vomit blood, Tang En simply spat it on Yema's face. The latter naturally roared and kept blinking, but there was nothing she could do. After spitting out the blood that was stuck in his throat, Tang En felt much more relaxed. He licked his broken lips. Don't misunderstand, even if Yema was crazy, she wouldn't bite that place. This was because when Tang En bit Yema, he was hit by the silver fighting energy on her body. When he woke up, Tang En immediately shook his head and knocked away Yema, who was like a mad dog. Bang! His brain suddenly felt dizzy again. He could no longer feel his left hand, but he still held Yema's right arm tightly. His 5 fingers almost penetrated Yema's body, and he held on to her ribs to stabilize her. At the same time, he opened his trembling right hand again, and spots of blood gathered on Yema's back. This was purely a subconscious action. At this point in the battle, all tactics and strategies were nonsense, and even logic was nonsense. As long as he hadn't completely fainted, his body memory function would continue to try. At this moment, suddenly, beep! The sound of the rapid wind suddenly turned into a sharp whistle, which was extremely ear-piercing. Hearing this, both of them trembled and looked down subconsciously. It was still dark and boundless below. However, both of them knew very well that this sharp whistle was clearly the sound of a heavy object falling from a high place. When it was about to hit the ground, because of the surrounding environment, it quickly bounced back and intersected with the flow of air. It was about to hit the ground. Realizing this, Yama's crazy expression instantly became clear, and there was finally a little panic in his eyes. He was a noble void-level warrior, and he didn't want to die with a nobody like Tang En. Roar! He suddenly raised his head and roared. The silver fighting energy around his body bloomed violently, and rays of light instantly pierced through the darkness like shining stars falling into the abyss, illuminating a large area around him. Most people would have a last burst of energy before they died, and they would do a lot of incredible things. Right now, Yama was no doubt like that. This time, he was definitely at his peak state. Even if his body was in perfect condition, he might not be able to do it. But now, at this critical moment of life and death, dragging his injured body, he suddenly burst out, "Shit!" Silently cursing, Tang En's face changed. His instantaneous reaction was of course not slow, even faster than Yema. He also expected that his opponent would make a final struggle. But his body was heavily injured, and his mind was on the verge of collapse, which slowed down Tang En's parry. In just a moment, Tang En's left arm, which he had been holding on to tightly, let out a few whines and loosened powerlessly. Yema's right arm was finally free. "Ha ha!" Laughing wildly, Yema, who was overjoyed, raised his arm, but halfway through, it only grazed Tang En's left shoulder. Immediately, there was a series of bone-cracking sounds, and it directly caved in. This time, it was not the camouflage effect of the bone shrinkage skill. In just a short moment, Tang En's left shoulder was seriously injured, and his left arm that was just about to grab Yama's right hand again completely collapsed. It's over. Tang En's heart suddenly sank and his face was full of bitterness and disappointment. Just a little bit more. It was all in vain, all in vain. Once Yama's right arm broke free, he could kill him on the spot with a casual slap. At this time, although the screams around them were getting more and more shrill, they did not reach the bottom of the mountain. This time, it was really a hopeless situation. Haha, go to hell. Yama's face was ferocious, and he raised his right arm high. Instantly, the silver light shone in all directions, brilliant but dangerously beautiful. Ha! At this time, Tang En, who knew that he was going to die, suddenly grinned and loosened his legs. You want to take revenge? I'd rather fall into a bloody pulp than let you off so easily. But at the same time, the right hand that was wrapped around Yama's back froze. Tang En looked over and saw that the bloody light was still gathering, but it had not formed a dagger yet. It was just an embryonic form that was similar to a short stick. Tang En pursed his lips and shook his head in disdain. Then, he continued to stab the incomplete bloody shadow short stick at Yama's back. Broken skill, you're going to kill me. It's fine if you don't give me the dagger, but you could at least give me a screwdriver. Puff. The sound of a weapon piercing into a warm body could be heard. Blood splattered everywhere, and Tang En's face was half filled with resentment and half stupefied. Ugh! They were still falling rapidly, but the two people who were entangled together looked like statues. Their expressions and movements were frozen, and they did not move at all. After a while, the silver light gradually dimmed. Yama lowered his head stiffly and looked at a thin stick with a bloody luster that pierced out of his left chest where his heart was. He squinted his eyes and found that there was a small blade at the top of the stick in the shape of a cross. He asked dryly, "What is this?" Tang En also looked at the cross blade in a daze and licked his lips. It looks like a screwdriver." "Oh!" Yama nodded slightly and seemed to have understood something. He also seemed to want to ask more, but the silver light had been completely extinguished. Yama closed his eyes regretfully and leaned back. Whoosh! In the whistling wind, the entangled figures of the two people suddenly separated. Tang En subconsciously reached out to grab him, but he only managed to grab a few pieces of his black robe. With a tearing sound, Yama's figure instantly disappeared into the surrounding dark environment. What's going on? That's it?" Scratching his head, Tang En was caught off guard and his expression was full of absurdity. Of course it's over. Regardless of how the screwdriver came out, it was indeed formed by gathering Tang En's blood chi. Of course, although the Empyrean blood blade's power was not bad, this skill was only at the lowest level, so it was undoubtedly impossible to penetrate the defense of a Void Realm martial artist so easily. However, the silver defensive light shield on Yama's body had already been destroyed in the previous entanglement. Just now, when he was free, he was anxious to kill Tang En, so he didn't restore the light shield immediately. This undoubtedly gave this strange screwdriver a heaven-sent opportunity. It easily pierced through Yama's body and went straight to his heart. At the same time, the blood chi contained in it exploded in an instant and directly exploded Yama's entire heart. In this way, Yama naturally had no choice but to die. Whoosh! Don't be like this. Can't you at least fly me up first? Yama, hey! When Tang En instantly woke up in this cold wind, his ecstasy only lasted for a few short breaths. Then, he looked at the dark environment around him and his face suddenly turned bitter. He unbuttoned his clothes while trembling, but before he could open them, they were instantly torn apart by the blade-like wind. Under such gravitational acceleration, there was nothing around him that could give him a temporary respite. Even if Tang En had a lot of skills, he could only stare helplessly now. What's more, the screams around him were getting more and more urgent. It was obvious that there was not much time left. It was not that Tang En couldn't react in time, but the world was changing too fast. Just a few minutes ago, Tang En was still hoping to fall to the ground as soon as possible, so that he could die together with his opponent. But now, he wished that this cliff abyss could become a bottomless pit, so that he could have some time to think about other ways to escape. Calm down, there must be a way, there must be. Just as Tang En's brain was spinning rapidly, the pores all over his body suddenly opened, and a chill instantly rushed up from his tailbone. The alarm bell rang. There was no doubt that this was a sharp premonition of impending danger. Too fast. Sighing secretly, Tang En immediately opened his eyes wide and stared down. His eyes were extremely greedy. It was said that before the Grim Reaper came, people's eyes would quickly flash through their whole life. But unfortunately, there was only darkness in Tang En's eyes, but his mind became more and more clear. Somehow, a question suddenly appeared in his mind. If I die, who will remember me? He immediately asked and answered his own question. Josiah, I'm the most familiar with her, so she will definitely remember me. As for the time, 10 years? It seems a bit long. Then, 3 years? Bah, my charm isn't that miserable, right? It'll take at least 5 years. Little Carol, TSK, children's thoughts are harder to guess. It might take a lifetime, or 2 or 3 years. David and the others should come to find me and avenge me. Unfortunately, I've already killed my enemy, so there's nothing left. Oh, and a group of friends in Lion City. Jack, Alan, Lena. Oh, forget about Jack. He'll forget about me in the blink of an eye if I give him a few gold coins. Alan and Lena, sigh. I haven't seen them for a long time. They should have already forgotten me. Haha, it's okay. There's also the washing machine. Isn't it said that it's already sold all over the country? Although I'm no longer in this world, there are still legends of me everywhere. Waha. Suddenly, his breathing stopped and a great pressure came head-on. It's finally over, my journey to another world. I wonder if I can be lucky enough to transmigrate again. Alright. When the alarm bell in his heart was ringing to its limit, Tang En suddenly remembered that there was still an important person that he had not taken care of, but there was not enough time. Bang! Voila! In the system space, the old butler looked at the light screen in front of him with his hands behind his back, his expression indifferent. Suddenly, a shrill cry resounded through the space. Old butler, I'm leaving, don't miss me too much. The voice lingered in the air, echoing endlessly, and sounded very creepy. Even someone as calm as the old butler could not help but twitch the corner of his eyes when he heard this shrill cry, and his mouth twitched slightly. At this moment, voila! On the light screen, Tang En fell straight into the calm underground lake like a cannonball, instantly splashing water tens of meters high into the sky. The waves were noisy, and the momentum was really shocking. That's right, who would have known that there was such an underground lake hidden at the bottom of the abyss under the cliff? It seemed to be a hopeless situation without any suspense, but there was a hidden life in this place where mountains and rivers intersected. Nature's uncanny workmanship was amazing. The old butler's expression was still indifferent, and he was not moved at all. Tang En could not see the bottom of the abyss with his naked eyes, but it did not mean that the system light screen could not see it. After about 3 minutes, the waves on the lake did not stop, but a figure suddenly emerged from the water. Needless to say, this was Tang En, who had survived a great disaster. In fact, falling from such a height, even if there was water below, an ordinary person would undoubtedly die in an instant when they touched it. Fortunately, Tang En was not an ordinary person, and the speed of his fall would be slightly reduced when the Yemor repeatedly broke out. In this way, Tang En was lucky enough to survive. However, even so, Tang En only floated out of the water in the light screen, and his hands and feet were subconsciously waving. His eyes were blank, and it was obvious that he had fallen into a daze, and he would not be able to recover in a short time. Seeing this, the old butler's expression softened slightly, and he shook his head slightly, as if he was also lamenting about this guy's heaven-defying luck. Then, just as the old butler waved his hand to turn off the light screen, his eyes suddenly focused, and he saw a black shadow suddenly appear on the light screen, flashing away and coincidentally smashing onto Tang En. Voila! Another monstrous splash. The old butler was startled, and then he waved his hand to change the angle of the light screen. First, he saw the woman who suddenly smashed down. Wasn't that Lan Sha? With Tang En as a cushion, not only did she not die, but she also did not faint. Then, he switched to Tang En, only to find that his eyes were tightly shut, and his mouth was bubbling with water, and he kept sinking. Needless to say, this was definitely the end of him. Phew! The old butler exhaled softly, and the corners of his mouth twitched a few times, and he was expressionless. This wretch! Chapter 635. Alright, since our main character, Tang En, thought of Josiah the moment before he died, then we might as well give him some face and turn our attention back to Bran to see what this Grey Coat Army intelligence chief was doing. Morning, Mountain Creek City. The cold wind was not cold and the sun was warm. Compared to the bone-chilling and uninhabitable northern wilderness, although it was also winter in Bran, in the holy city of the hinterland of the north, the winter chill was not as abnormal. Of course, this was relative. If it was from the mouths of the old women in Mountain Creek City, it would not be difficult to hear such nagging. This year's winter seems to be colder. The Riverside Tavern was a legitimate business. Just from the name, one would know what it did. Because the location was slightly remote, business was naturally not too good. Most of the customers who came were the old customers from around the area. It was quiet and indifferent. When the tavern had just opened, the surrounding civilians had also discussed it. They said that the tavern would probably not be open for long and that it would be like the previous owner of the tavern, who would choose to sell it after a period of time. But at least the current situation was not like this. Although the tavern's business was still not improving, it was still open for business as usual every day, rain or shine. Some of the old drunkards around were naturally overjoyed when they saw this. Sometimes, they would even deliberately call their friends over to buy a few cups of cheap ale to boost the popularity, fearing that the tavern would close down. If that was the case, they would have to run far away if they wanted to drink. These interesting and laughable actions caused the tavern's business to gradually improve for a period of time, making the owner somewhat unsure whether to laugh or cry. But in reality, these drunkards were completely overthinking. Because if there were no accidents, this tavern would continue to stand there. After all, it was the headquarters of the Grey Coat Army's secret organization. Of course, the so-called headquarters was actually just a saying. It was only called this because the highest leader of the secret organization, Josiah, often stayed here. Because it was in the morning, the tavern was extremely quiet. There were only 2 or 3 customers who looked like drunkards. They toasted each other, shook their heads and muttered from time to time, or suddenly cursed loudly, saying that life was not easy and so on. In addition, there was a middle-aged owner sitting by the door, calmly wiping the counter in front of him with a rag over and over again. He seemed to be used to this situation and had no intention of restraining the drunkards. But from time to time, he would cast his gaze to the corner of the hall and shake his head slightly, with a look of regret. Sitting there was a man with disheveled hair who was engrossed in drinking. The table was littered with empty wine jars. Because of the angle, it was not clear what he looked like. However, if there was someone who paid attention to details, he would find that although he looked a little sloppy, his back was straight. It wasn't done on purpose. Rather, it seemed to be a natural posture that had been trained for many years. It was the unique temperament of a soldier. At this moment, the man shook the wine jar in his hand, as if he had already finished it. Seeing this, the middle-aged owner sighed, got up and walked over. He knocked on the table and said softly, "Drink less. You should go back and rest." His hand paused, and he put down the bottle. That person slowly raised his head. He had a handsome appearance, and was not very old. However, the messy beard on his face, which was obviously ungroomed, and his bloodshot eyes made him look even more down and out. Of course, this was not the most important thing. The most important thing was the long and terrifying scar that stretched from the corner of his left eye to his chin, destroying his handsome appearance. Coupled with his current appearance, he looked somewhat ferocious. However, although his face was ferocious and he had drunk a lot of wine, there was not a single empty bottle on the floor. It could be seen that the young man still had some self-control and had not lost his mind. Nodding slightly, he accepted the concern. The young man was easy to talk to. He stood up unsteadily with the bottle of wine that had just been opened and staggered towards the back door of the tavern. It was unknown whether he was a guest here or an employee of the tavern. Eat, dine and dash? A drunkard who was not far away also stood up unsteadily when he saw the young man leave without paying the bill. He rolled up his sleeves and said with a face full of indignation, "Boss, don't be afraid, I'll help you get justice. And kid, don't go. It's a misunderstanding, a misunderstanding." The middle-aged shopkeeper was stunned when he saw this. He hurriedly went up to block the drunkard. "He's my long-term guest. I've already given him enough money." "So it's like that. That's good. Boss, if you encounter any situation in the future, just look for me. I, Hussein, will definitely cover this area. Yes. I'll have to trouble you in the future." While the middle-aged owner was dealing with the customers of the tavern, the young man didn't seem to have heard the small dispute. He didn't stop walking and staggered out of the tavern's hall through the back door. There were a few steps at the back door. When the young man reached here, he narrowed his slightly red eyes and walked with difficulty. He swayed 3 times and looked like he was about to fall. At this moment, a person who was dressed as a waiter of the tavern rushed in from the front door with a piece of white paper in his hand. He looked at the middle-aged owner and nodded. Then he quickly ran to the back door as if he had something urgent to do. The steps weren't wide. Although the waiter had already dodged and was about to pass through from the side, he didn't expect that the young man would stagger and the two would bump into each other. Bang! The waiter was fine. He waved the white paper in his hand and quickly stabilized himself. However, the young man who drank too much couldn't stand it. His body tilted and he sat down on the step. Seeing this, the waiter quickly bent over to support him. He glanced around and apologized in a low voice. "I'm sorry, Master Borg. I walked in a hurry." "It's okay. It has nothing to do with you. I drank too much." The young man waved his hand and got up from the ground. He glanced around and saw the word "wanted" on the white paper in the waiter's hand. There was also a portrait. He asked casually, "What is this?" The waiter hesitated for a moment and replied, "This is something to report to the commander." The so-called commander was naturally Josiah's other identity, the commander of the Gray Coat Army's publicity department. For the safety of the leader of the secret organization, Josiah didn't care about it at all. Therefore, although her current position was much higher than the commander, the people in the organization usually called her commander. "Josiah." The young man narrowed his eyes. His gaze was complicated. After a moment, he waved his hand and said, "I'm fine. Go do your thing." "Yes." Seeing the waiter turn to the left and walk away, the young man stood there in a daze. Then he shook his head and drank a mouthful of wine. He continued to stagger forward. Yes, this young man was Borg, whom he hadn't seen for a long time. The battle between the Bran and the Northern Wilderness had ended long ago. As one of the middle-level generals of the Gray Coat Army who reinforced the Bran, he naturally shouldn't be here alone. Moreover, he had been here for nearly a month. The reason was naturally because of that embarrassing incident. After Borg's face was disfigured, he led his troops to retreat to the Zechen Legion's defense area. He suddenly encountered Josiah in the frontline city, but he was immediately slapped in the face. Then, Borg lost his mind and ordered his soldiers to attack Michaud. As a result, not only did he not gain any advantage, but after Michaud announced that he was a wounded soldier under Frey's command, he was beaten up by the passing Thunderbolt's army soldiers and was finally imprisoned by Zechen's soldiers. This incident wasn't very big, but it was naturally impossible to pretend that it didn't happen. The Thunderbolt's soldiers who beat Michaud were justified, and Borg became a villain who intended to destroy the cooperation between the two sides. The Zechen Legion naturally didn't care about this matter. In the end, they simply pushed the blame to the frontline generals of the Grey Coat Army. Because of his identity, Borg didn't receive any punishment. Of course, it was undoubtedly unrealistic for him to continue to stay at the front line. Using the injury on his face, Borg was reprimanded by the highest general of the Grey Coat Army stationed at the front line, General Daniel, and left the front line dejectedly. After Borg's third uncle, Enoch of the secret organization, received the news, he sent someone to pick him up. He wanted him to recuperate in the city behind the front line and adjust his condition. However, judging from the current situation, Borg's condition obviously hadn't adjusted well. On the contrary, after looking at the scar on his face and touching the place where Josiah slapped him, Borg's heart felt as if it was being devoured by thousands of ants. He tossed and turned in torment, and could only numb himself with alcohol all day long in exchange for a moment of peace. "Ha, how dare you hit me, that woman bitch!" With his head tilted back and his footsteps staggering, the scar on Borg's face was like a living centipede at this time, twisting and twisting, slightly red, and truly hideous and terrifying. His footsteps suddenly stopped and Borg shook his head. Only then did he realize that he wasn't walking toward the guest room. Instead, he subconsciously came to the place where Josiah was discussing matters. Slap! Borg suddenly raised his hand and slapped himself heavily in the face. He hugged his head and growled, "You're still thinking about her, still thinking about that bitch. Borg, you idiot, idiot!" He insulted himself like a madman. His foul language was extremely unpleasant to the ears. After a moment, Borg turned around while panting and walked back. However, he only took a few steps before he suddenly turned his head and looked at the meeting place with a strange expression. "Haha, it's okay to take a look, this bitch. Just one more look, oh bitch." Chapter 636. His footsteps were messy as he carried the wine jar and muttered, "Bitch, bitch," although he was deceiving himself, since he had already made up his mind. Borg could not resist the inexplicable desire in his heart and staggered toward the meeting hall. When he was only a few dozen meters away, he glanced around with his slightly red eyes and muttered, "Ah, there are even sentries." After all, this was the headquarters of a secret organization, not to mention an important meeting place. Naturally, there were many sentries around, whether in the open or in the dark. Of course, Borg was not an outsider and had lived here for more than a month, so no guards came forward to stop him. There seemed to be more people than before. "I'd like to see what you're up to." Borg shook his head in disdain as he scanned the sudden increase in guards with his hazy, drunken eyes. He paused and then walked around the meeting hall to the left. The attention of the surrounding sentries was focused on the periphery, and Borg was not on guard against his own people. Now that he had already bypassed the meeting hall, it was naturally impossible for them to track and monitor him. Therefore, after Borg avoided the sentries, he suddenly passed through a few flower bushes diagonally and arrived at the back of the meeting hall without anyone noticing. There were naturally sentries here, but Borg's current position was ingenious. He hid beside the flower bushes under the back window and was an out-and-out surveillance blind spot. Putting everything else aside, just based on his skillful hiding and sneaking around, perhaps he knew that this was not the first time Borg had done something like this. Damn it, why are the doors and windows all closed? Isn't it here? Or was the person just lying to me? Borg looked up and squinted at the completely closed meeting hall, and could not help but frown and curse. An important place like the meeting hall was naturally heavily guarded, but it was impossible to completely close the doors and windows every time something was discussed. In fact, from Borg's words just now, he knew that this was not the case before. However, Borg immediately knew that the waiter did not lie to him because he could still faintly hear the conversation inside through the back window. So mysterious! Borg sneered disdainfully and stood up with the wine jar in his hand. He could not help but look disappointed. His purpose of coming here was to peek at Josiah. Now that the doors and windows were locked, there was naturally no need to stay any longer. However, just as he turned around, a voice suddenly sounded out by his ear, causing Borg's body to suddenly tremble. He opened his mouth and was slightly stunned. Tang-en? That bastard! In the conference hall. The space in the room was not small, but after the room was cleared, there was only Josiah in his white robe and the waiter from before. Captain, according to reliable sources, Sylvia has returned to Bran a few days ago. However, we haven't found her exact location yet. She should be in a church somewhere. After Sylvia returned, this wanted notice from the headquarters of the Northern Temple of Light was urgently sent to every city. It should cover the entire north in a few days. Well, there's an unfamiliar face on it. I'm not sure if it's Tang-en. Josiah took the notice and glanced at the wanted portrait on it. He bit his lip and said with certainty. Nodding, the waiter also agreed with this guess. After all, Sylvia had disappeared while chasing after Tang-en. Now that she had returned, the Temple of Light issued such a wanted notice. Naturally, it was easy for people to associate it with Tang-en. Moreover, Josiah was very clear about Tang-en's ability to disguise himself, so it was not surprising that such an unfamiliar face would appear. The waiter was arranged to do such a job, so he was naturally Josiah's absolute confidant. Naturally, he knew a thing or two about the inside story and Tang-en's ability. He looked up at Josiah, who was in a rare daze, and whispered, "Captain, don't worry. Since Sylvia issued such a wanted notice when she returned, it means that Captain Tang-en has escaped this disaster. I believe that he will return to Bran soon." Yes. There was no doubt that this speculation was reasonable. Joshua nodded slightly upon hearing this, and the corner of her mouth lifted into a bright and relaxed smile. He, of course, with his ability, even if he enters the northern wilderness, he will be able to escape unscathed. It was obvious that after hearing this news, Josiah was in a good mood. In fact, he was quite excited. Pause for a while. Chingchong's fingers tapped lightly on the table before her. She calmed herself down and said with a smile, "Everyone, you've done well this time. I will reward you later." Captain, this is what we should do." With a wave of his hand, Josiah stopped the waiter, who stood up to salute, and said with a smile, "Haha, this is what you deserve. Furthermore, the current secret agency is not as poor as before, so of course you will be rewarded. But—" She paused, and her slender shoulders straightened. Her beautiful face was solemn. "Please keep this a secret. If there is even the slightest leak, I will not let you off easily. As the saying goes, the environment changes the body." Josiah, who was getting more and more used to it, naturally did not have the difficult situation that he had when he first took over the secret agency. His expression darkened slightly, and under the combination of kindness and authority, there was an intimidating presence that could not be moved by 10,000 mountains. The waiter's breath caught, and he quickly stood up and bowed. He replied seriously, "Don't worry, Captain. This will only rot in our minds and will not be leaked. Josiah nodded, and his serious expression quickly relaxed. You are all personally handpicked by me, so of course I am not worried. This is just for your benefit. After all, if this is exposed, the consequences will be unpredictable. Go, send the message to the front line and tell them to work harder and continue to keep an eye on the border. If you can meet Tang En, it would be best if you can tell him about the situation. Yes. The waiter bowed again and turned to open the door of the meeting room. Wait a minute. As if remembering something, Josiah frowned and asked, Is there still no news of little Carol? I am incompetent. The organizations in various cities have sent people to search for her, but there is still no accurate news. It's okay. No news is also good news. He raised his head and gently touched his forehead. He shook his head slightly. Under Tang En's teachings, little Carol is first class in terms of martial arts, strength, hiding, and disguise. It is reasonable that you can't find her. Go, send people to continue the search. Yes. Bang. As soon as the door closed. Phew. Josiah's straight shoulders and back relaxed instantly. He let out a long breath and stroked the wanted portrait with his right hand. Joy, anticipation, disappointment. All kinds of emotions mixed together. His expression was complicated and indescribable, but it was mostly excitement. In the dark hall, bright light penetrated through the cracks of the doors and windows. There was dust floating in the air, and it was quiet. After a while, a sigh of relief sounded. I know you will be fine, Tang En. Josiah had been collecting information about Tang En from beginning to end. She even went to the front line for this. Unfortunately, when she arrived at the front line, she just happened to pass by Tang En. Then, she got the news from various channels that Sylvia had chased Tang En into the northern wilderness. After confirming the authenticity of this news, Josiah was stunned for a long time. Then, she began to collect information about Sylvia. However, the more information she gathered, the more uncertain Josiah became. She vaguely knew that Sylvia's strength should be higher than Tang En's. Realizing this, Josiah was undoubtedly more worried and anxious. However, she was the supreme leader of the secret organization. Naturally, she could not stay at the front line for a long time. So, in the end, she could only return to Mountain Stream City after setting up branches in the cities near the border. Of course, although Josiah's people returned to the hinterland of the northern Bran, she had some free time. Her attention was always on the front line. To be honest, Josiah was very conflicted at that time. On one hand, she hoped to get the news as soon as possible. On the other hand, she was afraid that something bad would happen. She faintly resisted the news. After waiting anxiously for a whole month, she finally got the news about Tang En. It was good news. Josiah's mood was unquestionably excited. Her slender fingers tapped on the table rapidly, like a cheerful sonata. Then, she got up and walked back and forth a few steps. Suddenly, she touched her forehead. Oh, I almost forgot. I should send a message to Dawn City. Where's a pen and paper? Just as Josiah was excitedly searching for a pen and paper in the room, Borg, who was outside the back window, took a few steps back. His slightly red eyes flashed with a strange light. The corners of his mouth gradually cracked open. Haha, it seems like I heard a very important piece of news. Sylvia? Is it the sensational incident at the front line canyon? I really didn't expect it. Tang En, Tang En. After muttering to himself for a few seconds, Borg suddenly raised his head and gulped down a large mouthful of wine. He strode to the side with a vicious expression. Ha, this time, I want to see if you can survive. Chapter 637. At noon, in a corner of the western district of Mountain Creek City. Rows of single-story houses were arranged neatly, and the monotonous black and gray walls contrasted with each other. It looked a little awkward, like an unfinished abstract ink painting. The narrow streets were filled with dust and potholes, like a piece of cheese that had been left out for a long time. It was obviously not suitable for any means of transportation other than walking. Every city had its glamorous side, but of course there would also be dirty and dilapidated corners. This was unavoidable, and even Mountain Creek City, which was known as the Holy City of the North, was no exception. At this moment, in a corner of the street, "Excuse me, does Painter Hungseer live here?" "Hungseer? You mean that poor painter, right?" "Yes, follow this street and walk all the way to the innermost left." "Oh, thank you, Auntie." "Ha, you're welcome." After bidding farewell to the kind auntie, the passerby pulled down the furry collar that covered his face tightly, revealing a long scar that looked like a centipede. Needless to say, this was Borg, who had just come out of the tavern by the stream. The street was not long, and he soon reached the end. The innermost left. "Tsk, it should be this." Borg narrowed his eyes and looked at the dilapidated house in front of him. He nodded, took a few steps forward, and knocked on the wooden door. Bang, bang, bang. Bang, bang, bang. The knocking continued, but there was no sound from inside, as if the owner was not home. However, just as Borg frowned, the door creaked open. "Who are you?" The person who opened the door was a middle-aged man. His eyes were sunken, and his body was thin. He wore a loose robe that was wrinkled, and had not been washed for a long time. He looked tired and sleepy. "Who I am is not important. Are you Painter Hungseer?" Seeing that the middle-aged man nodded subconsciously, Borg's lips curled into a strange sneer. He opened his left hand, revealing a few shiny gold coins that had an attractive luster. "I'll talk about the characteristics, and you can draw a portrait. As long as I'm satisfied, these 5 gold coins are yours." The middle-aged man called Hansel was stunned at first, but then he was overjoyed. Just by looking at the surrounding environment, one could tell that his living conditions were very bad. Just a portrait and he could earn 5 gold coins. This was indeed a great temptation to him. That's right, art cannot be measured by money. But sometimes artists also need money to survive. No problem. At first, he hurriedly agreed. Then, he scratched his head and looked hesitant. "Although I have never doubted my drawing skills, why did you come looking for me? You should know that this place of mine is very remote." "That's exactly what I want." Borg's expression didn't change, and he didn't answer the question. Instead, he pushed the door open and entered. "Let's begin." "Okay." The room was in a mess. Paper and brushes were scattered everywhere. Even the walls were painted with various patterns. It was indeed the appearance of a destitute artist. Soon, after setting up the easel, Hansel looked at Borg with a brush in his hand. The latter pinched his chin and pondered for a moment before saying, "It's a young man. His hair is black and not long. As for his face, well, it's very ordinary." While Borg was frowning as he tried to recall, Hansel held the paintbrush and gestured a few times. In the end, he still couldn't draw. He helplessly raised his head and said, "Mister, please describe it in more detail. For example, the shape of his nose, the size of his lips, whether his cheekbones are obvious. Also, what are his distinctive features?" Distinctive features. Borg pinched the bridge of his nose and looked a little conflicted. "Ordinary, very ordinary." "Oh, there's a distinctive feature." Just as Hansel was speechless, Borg's eyes suddenly lit up. He clapped his hands and said, "His eyes are slimmer than ordinary people, and his pupils are black. It's disgusting to look at." "Slimmer eyes, black pupils? That's not common." "Okay, count it as a distinctive feature." Hansel's brush moved slightly. First, he drew the outline, then he carefully drew a pair of slimmer eyes. He asked, "What else?" "And ordinary." The progress of the portrait wasn't smooth. It wasn't that Hansel's skills weren't good enough. It was only now that Borg realized how difficult it was to accurately depict the annoying guy in his heart. It wasn't that he couldn't remember. Borg remembered the guy's face very clearly, as if it was carved into his heart. But remembering it clearly didn't mean that he could accurately depict it. Oh, that damn common face! Fortunately, Hansel's drawing skills were quite good. Although it took a lot of effort, the two of them continued to gesture and discuss, and finally succeeded in drawing it. Humph! With just a glance, Borg's eyes suddenly flashed with a fierce light. He snorted and clenched his fist. Needless to say, from this reaction, the drawing was very good. On the drawing paper, there was an average-sized nose, average-sized lips, average-sized ears, average-sized eyebrows. Other than the long and narrow eyes, almost all of the facial features were average size. It was very ordinary. This was the legendary common face, the Tang En that we were all familiar with. Barely suppressing the inexplicable anger in his heart, Borg nodded and praised. "Not bad, I'm very satisfied." Then, under Hansel's expectant gaze, he reached into his pocket as if to take out a gold coin, but when he reached out, it was a short sword. With a cold flash, poof, it directly pierced into Hansel's heart. "Sorry, your drawing skills are too good. So good that I don't dare to let you live." Stumbling a few steps, Hansel's eyes were filled with confusion and pain. He leaned back, bang. A few easels were knocked over, and the drawing paper on the ground was instantly stained with blood. After twitching a few times, he fell silent and stopped moving. Glancing at the corpse on the ground, Borg let out a long sigh. The gloominess in his heart because of a certain person dissipated instantly. What Borg said just now seemed like a joke, but in fact it was from his heart. In fact, when Hansel took on this business, this was destined to be the outcome. After seeing that Hansel's drawing skills were indeed good, Borg naturally couldn't let him live. After all, if something happened, his portrait would undoubtedly be easier to draw. Bending over to take the brush in Hansel's hand, Borg didn't intend to deal with the corpse on the ground. It was obvious that such a reclusive artist wouldn't interact much with the people around him. Perhaps only when the corpse started to smell would people find out. He picked up a blank drawing paper and swept away the debris on the table beside him. In this room that was gradually filled with the smell of blood, Borg calmly pulled a wooden chair and sat down. After pondering for a while, he began to draw and murmured softly, "Tang En, an Earth-level warrior, proficient in disguise, a member of the Grey Coat Army." Well, should I write this? The brush stopped and he tilted his head. Only by revealing this identity could he logically lead Tang En to sneak into the army and go to the front line, and then what happened in the canyon afterward, so he decided to continue writing. "Oh, you have a small team in the gray space. Humph, how dare you set me up, Michaud, and you can't escape. Should I add Josiah? She's also one of the accomplices. TSK, no, I'm also temporarily living in the tavern by the creek. Okay, I'll be merciful and give you a chance, haha." The room was dim, and the smell of blood was getting stronger, but Borg, who was busy drawing, didn't seem to feel it. From time to time, he whispered in a low voice, or raised his head and laughed wildly, causing his body to constantly tremble. It was an indescribably strange scene. Half an hour later, outside the church of Mountain Stream City, Borg, who had covered his face again, wandered for 2 or 3 minutes, then walked to a little boy who was playing. He bent down and spread out his palm, all kinds of colorful candies. "Little boy, can you do Uncle a favor? As long as you give these 2 pieces of paper to the uncle and aunt in the church, these candies are all yours." Licking his lips and looking at the tempting candies, the little boy nodded heavily. Good boy, Uncle will reward you first." "Well, take it, go." During the day, the church was of course open. After receiving the reward, the little boy's legs moved quickly and he ran into the church. Ignorant, he didn't know what kind of monstrous waves the thin paper in his hand, which was only worth a few candies, would cause. Of course, in fact, even Borg, the initiator, would never have thought that the situation would be out of control. Perhaps he had some feeling in his heart, but the slight drunkenness and the humiliation and hatred in his head had completely blinded his heart and eyes. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.